There are some things human beings aren't meant to know, and it's the sworn duty of the SCP Foundation to discover and contain such information. But sometimes knowledge is discovered that shakes even the Foundation itself to its very core. One such discovery occurred on April 28, 2016. That night, SCP-2935 made itself known to the Foundation personnel. To this day, the exact nature of SCP-2935 is a mystery that even the Foundation's brightest minds can't completely understand. Everything we know about SCP-2935 today comes from 3 doomed missions to the anomalous zone's interior. This is the story of those infamous expeditions. The nightmare began around 5 a.m. when SCP Foundation Site-81 in Bloomingdale, Indiana, intercepted a distorted radio signal. Communications personnel at the site traced this strange signal back to the unincorporated area of Joppa, Indiana, near U.S. Interstate 70. As is Foundation policy, a team of field agents were dispatched to the location in order to determine what they were dealing with. However, rather than finding anything that could logically produce such a signal, they instead discovered a long-abandoned cemetery. The most recent death on any of the tombstones was recorded as being over 100 years ago, all the way back in 1908. On further investigation, the Foundation discovered an unmapped limestone cave opening beneath the cemetery, and when they sent a drone into the depths of the cave, it appeared to quickly exit out the other side of the cave. But something wasn't right. The area that the drone was observing appeared consistent with the landscape from which it entered, but now it looked somehow grayer. It lacked the color of life of the place it just come from. The grass was dead, there were no trees, no shrubs, no animals or birds in the sky. They weren't looking at our world, they were looking at a strange reflection of our world on the other side of the cave. In fact, it wasn't a cave at all, it was a passageway between 2 dimensions. It was SCP-2935. Just then, they were able to unscramble the distorted transmission they'd been receiving. It went as follows. This is an automated emergency broadcast from the SCP Foundation and your national government. One or more of our sites is experiencing a communication breakdown, likely due to a containment breach of unknown magnitude. All citizens are ordered to stay in their homes as containment teams work to secure the breach. This message will broadcast from April 20th, 2016 until… At that point, the message would cut and repeat, as it had for 8 straight days. The message source? Site-81, but not this Site-81. The SCP Foundation was receiving an emergency distress signal from themselves in another dimension, a bizarre event that even the Foundation had never experienced before. Field agents were terrified by the implications of what they just heard and contacted Site-81 Command to request additional units. The Foundation wished to fully understand this anomaly as quickly as possible due to the potential threat it could pose toward the Foundation, so they dispatched Mobile Task Force Epsilon 13, codenamed Manifest Destiny, to perform the first of 3 manned missions into the heart of the anomalous zone. The first exploratory mission into SCP-2935 was codenamed Gauntlet and consisted of a 4-man team fitted with full hazmat suits and direct video and audio links to Mission Command. The team was led by a field operative known only as Agent Juno. His subordinates were Agents Kale, Devon, and Underwood. Their directive was to gather samples and survey the area positioned directly around the insertion point, meaning the other cave mouth of SCP-2935. The mission only lasted about an hour, but what they saw in there would stay with these men for the rest of their lives. After a 15-minute trek through the cave, Manifest Destiny arrived in the mirror dimension, where they were struck by the eerie silence of a place that seemed identical and yet so different from their home dimension. The first observation they made was the total absence of all living vegetation. Trees, grass, weeds, everything, it was all dead. On orders from their superiors back in the original dimension, that we'll refer to from here on as Dimension Prime, Manifest Destiny headed deeper into the mirror dimension of SCP-2935. They traveled 2 kilometers without detecting a single sign of plant or animal life, not even insects. Eventually, they came upon a farmhouse with 2 cars parked outside. With authorization from Command, Manifest Destiny breached the house and headed inside. Agent Kale confirmed that there was still power flowing to the building, as the lighting appeared to work just fine, but they came upon a horrifying discovery in the house's dining room. 3 adult corpses, 2 female, 1 male, were seated at the table. A 4th corpse, that of a male child, was sprawled out on the ground nearby. As if the death of what looked to be an entire family wasn't awful enough, the Manifest Destiny team noticed a number of other alarming details. There were no signs of decomposition on the bodies, nor did there appear to be any obvious cause of death. The family's last meal was still on the table: chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. While the food looked cold and stale, there was no evidence of rot or spoiling. The team found an open newspaper dated April 19, 2016, illustrating that the family may have died a full 8 days before the discovery. In Dimension Prime, decay would already be very well underway by that point, yet here there wasn't even a smell. Instead, everything was just covered in a thin layer of dust. Command requested that Manifest Destiny collect samples of the food as well as hair, skin, and fluids from the corpses for further study. Small electronics like smartphones were also taken from the bodies. Agent Devon turned on the television in the living room and found that while most stations were now running test signals, the shopping channel was still live. Well, the feed was live at least. Both hosts sat in front of the cameras dead, but perfectly preserved. The date on the screen read April 28, 2016. Suggesting that the times of Dimension Prime and Mirror Dimension were exactly the same. In fact, everything seemed the same, the only difference between the two dimensions being that some kind of mysterious apocalyptic event had occurred in the last 8 days in SCP-2935's Mirror Dimension, but exactly what had happened or how remained a mystery. When Manifest Destiny exited the farmhouse, they once again remarked on the lack of all signs of life around them. At this point, the team returned to the insertion point of SCP-2935, but were instructed to remain in the Mirror Dimension while additional units joined them inside. Manifest Destiny swelled to 16 members, with the notable addition of Agent Roy as the new commanding field officer. The team split into 2 groups of 8, and Agent Roy and his men infiltrated the Mirror Dimension Site-81, while Agent Juno's detachment attempted to access the base's off-site deep storage servers. This second expedition was codenamed Overland, and led the Foundation's field agents even deeper into the terrifying mystery of SCP-2935. Accessing the site was easy for Roy's detachment. It seemed there were relatively few cars on the road at the time of the mysterious extinction event. In the distance, fire still smoldered in the wreckage of planes that looked to have just dropped out of the sky. Agent Roy and his team, like all SCP Foundation personnel, were fitted with vitals trackers, and they assumed that the distress signal that started this whole thing could have been triggered by the deaths of every member of the Foundation at once in the Mirror Universe. Once inside Site-81, they realized that the assumption was probably right. Going door to door in the administrative wing, they found the perfectly preserved corpses of everyone they knew to be stationed there in Dimension Prime. People who were without a doubt still alive in their universe. Samples from the corpses that the Foundation would later study even confirmed the reason that the bodies were perfectly preserved. The corpses had experienced complete and sudden death on a cellular level, and even the bacteria that would typically take part in the decomposition process had died with it. In SCP-2935, death was total and absolute, across all types of life forms. As Agent Roy's team ventured further into the bowels of Site-81, they made another unsettling discovery: their own corpses, in roughly the same spots they'd been inside Dimension Prime Site-81 8 days prior. Some of the Foundation's top scientists, including the esteemed Dr. Bright, were also found dead inside the facility. In an attempt to see just how far this unexplained phenomenon stretched, Agent Roy's team decided to inspect the containment cells, where they found that all the Mirror Universe's SCPs, including SCP-2996, were dead. In his desperation to find some kind of exception to the extinction event, Agent Roy revealed a terrifying secret to the rest of his team. SCP-682, the immortal misanthropic lizard and one of the deadliest creatures known to the SCP Foundation, was contained at this very facility right below them. Could it have something to do with what was going on here? They descended into the containment facility to discover an even more unsettling truth. SCP-682, the unkillable anomaly, floated dead in its tank. Death truly made no exceptions within SCP-2935. Agent Roy's team left the site and rendezvoused with Agent Juno's team to send their research back to Dimension Prime using automated drones. Both teams remained in the Mirror Dimension for another manned operation codenamed 19. They had no idea it would be their final mission. As they descended deeper into the facility, passing more dead SCPs, they discovered one final clue. Based on the activity of the Foundation servers, the event occurred at roughly 3 a.m. While underground in SCP-2935 Site-81, the team accidentally activated the base's on-site nuclear weapon, a failsafe meant to be detonated in the case of an emergency containment breach. Due to the base's failsafe protocols, every member of the Manifest Destiny team was locked and sealed inside Site-81. They, along with everything else, were incinerated in the nuclear blast. Once again, the mirror universe inside of SCP-2935 was lifeless. But that isn't where it ends. When the automated drones returned out of the SCP-2935 cave to the field operations in Dimension Prime, they were in for their own horrifying discovery. None of the footage or information gathered from SCP-2935 illuminated how or why the extinction event occurred. Everyone and everything simply dropped dead at the exact same moment. Nobody was aware, nobody was prepared. Death came suddenly and silently, and none were spared. All the Foundation on Dimension Prime were left with was a message from one of the agents from Manifest Destiny, Agent Keller. His final message was, "I don't have any answers. I don't think there are any. I'll do this one thing and hope that fixes it. Seal it shut. You've got to lock it in here with us. I'm sorry." The Foundation were at first confused by this until they discovered a final encrypted audio log buried in the files recovered from the Mirror Universe's Site-81. It was a message from Keller himself, but not the Keller from Universe Prime. In this message, Keller described the Foundation in the Mirror Universe receiving the exact same distorted transmission that they did a few days earlier from a cave in Joppa. When he and the others were dispatched inside, they discovered the same lifeless post-extinction event world that was now so familiar to the Foundation command. But there was a key difference. This wasn't the mirror dimension they'd just been studying, but a third, entirely different dimension. In his haunting final words, Mirror Dimension Keller admits that whatever caused the event in that third dimension, an entity in that mirror dimension Keller believed this was the specter of death itself and had followed him back into his world, and history had repeated itself. SCP-2935 was the passageway through which absolute death could pass from dimension to dimension, and our dimension was the next in line. The deaths of Manifest Destiny may have saved our entire universe, as anyone passing back through the cave had the potential to bring death itself back with them. The Foundation decided in the end to follow Keller's advice. They sealed the entrance to SCP-2935 with concrete and now kept it under constant watch, since what waits behind the barrier is an entity even they have no power to stop if it ever got through. After all, it had killed them all before, or at least another version of them. What's one more dimension on the pile? Why, it may now just seem like a simple slab of concrete under an abandoned cemetery. This is why SCP-2935 might be the most dangerous SCP of all.
1835. The American Frontier. A beacon of hope in a world choked with blood and smog. Little did the hopeful citizens of a still newly independent United States know. The evils of the old world had followed them here. Sometimes it took the form of hate, of violence, of desperation and starvation. But sometimes pure evil wasn't just some abstract concept existing in and around all of us. Sometimes that evil, that pure cruelty, malice, and greed, walks in the shape of a man. One such man was James Anderson, an unremarkable name for a truly exceptional man. Exceptional in the sense that if most human beings aren't willing to sell out all of humanity for their own petty gain, James Anderson is definitely the exception. After all, it's by his design that we have SCP-001, the anomaly that set the SCP Foundation and our entire reality down its current path. Of course, you know the deal with SCP-001. Not one anomaly, but many. A collective designation for a vast number of entries, all of which spell beginnings or ends for the SCP Foundation and sometimes even our universe. Scarlet Kings, Howling Black Moons, Ouroboros Cycles, and Gate Guardians. You've heard them all and seen the files. But unlike all the others, there is no file for the factory. That's because the full story only exists in the mind of O5-1, one of the most powerful and arguably the oldest member of the SCP Foundation. He'll die before he ever commits the story to paper. Some memories are just too awful to record. Their details and implications are too painful to ever subject others to. SCP-001 isn't just about Anderson and his atrocities. It's about all the terrible nightmares that unfolded afterward, and the deal with the devil that O5-1 struck to lock them away. For now, at least. But it all begins with James Anderson. His family had become incredibly wealthy in the Revolutionary War, and in the decades since, his fortune had only multiplied, as fortunes tend to do. In the early 1800s, he began work on his beautiful and horrific magnum opus, the Anderson Factory. It would be the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution, the manufacturing plant to end all manufacturing plants. 3 stories tall and a mile wide, Company towns had existed for a long time, but this time, the factory itself was the town. It had everything a worker would ever need. They would live, sleep, play, and most importantly of all, work in the same place. They would never need to leave. All their wants and needs from cradle to grave would be met in the Anderson factory. And all that Mr. Anderson ever asked in return was loyalty and service. Was that really so much to ask from those whom he gave everything? It may sound like a horrifying form of indentured servitude to us, but to the people in the United States in the early 1830s, this kind of security and stability was a godsend. To many itinerant workers and unstable families across the plains, James Anderson seemed like a saint. Little did they know, his plans for the factory and them were anything but saintly. Nobody knows exactly what type of dark magic James Anderson devoted himself to. Many have theorized as to whether it was Satan he worshipped, ancient pagan deities, or something older and more powerful than both. In actuality, the only thing that James Anderson really worshipped was himself, and the pursuit of more material wealth and power over his fellow man. Any pacts he made with evil, timeless gods were just means to an end. The Anderson factory was a citadel to one man's cruelty and corruption, and every element of the building's design seemed to reflect that. Groups of 8 were forced into rooms together like battery-farmed chickens to maximize cost efficiency. People worked day and night in shifts of 3. Machines always rumbled and roared and chewed. When workers died in factory accidents and their blood spilled on the ground, it seemed to reveal arcane symbols carved into the stonework. These symbols were only visible when blood flowed across them. While people traveled hundreds of miles to live and work at the Anderson factory, they had no idea that they were working towards slavery, subjugation, and death under Anderson's iron will. And in some cases, fates much, much worse. The factory remained in operation like this for 40 years, while Anderson himself enjoyed a positive public reputation as a groundbreaking industrialist. How Anderson got away with his crimes for so long is sadly a tale as old as time. The factory made valuable products and an awful lot of profit. So, no matter how many rumors swirled about inhumane practices or arcane rites going on in the Anderson factory, nothing was ever done. It was just too inconvenient to ever reckon with the horrible truth underneath the productive surface. And it was truly productive. The factory was so huge and filled with such a multitude of enslaved workers, there wasn't anything they didn't produce. From textiles to technology to crops and meat, the machines were always on. The furnaces always burned. Anderson himself seemed obsessed with 2 things: efficiency and misanthropy, the contempt and hatred for humanity itself. He believed his workers were lower than him. They only existed as a means to his nightmarish ends. And if ever the workers became too injured to work, well, that doesn't mean that Anderson wouldn't still find ways to put them to good use. The lucky ones, starved and neglected or broken by the stress of work or the grinding gears of the machines, were used as material in the production of products. Some were drained of blood so that they could be used in the forging of metal. Others were ground up into meat slurry and used to pad out the beef, making it go further. People all across the country enjoying fine Anderson brand steaks had no idea that they were actually dining on human flesh the whole time. But as we said, the ones who ended up being cooked into steaks and hamburgers after death were the lucky ones, because at least they got to die. The truly unlucky injured workers became the subject of James Anderson's horrific occult experiments. Using a mix of twisted science and black magic, he turned men into abominations, powerful, terrifying monsters stronger and more deadly than any mortal man. Anderson was building himself an anomalous army, but it wasn't just monsters. There were just as many so-called normal humans helping him rule over the Anderson factory with an iron fist. They were vicious sadists themselves, spurred on by absolute loyalty to their immoral master. It was only after the Civil War that someone finally escaped the Anderson factory and confirmed that not only were the most horrific rumors about the place true, but they didn't even come close to covering the totality of what was going on there. When President Grant heard the reports, he was disgusted. As far as he was concerned, the atrocities of James Anderson should not be allowed to go on a minute longer. The directive was simple: find the factory, free its prisoners, and put James Anderson to death for his crimes. And thankfully, President Grant had the perfect group of operatives for the job. They were an elite unit of around 150 soldiers who performed a number of dangerous missions beyond enemy lines down south. Espionage, assassination, psychological warfare. But these missions weren't just against the Confederates. Some of the enemies they faced down south were things that could not be explained. The strange, the frightening, the anomalous. And the highest-ranking soldier in this unit was a man who would one day become the legendary 05-1. He and his men made their long and treacherous journey to the factory, a trip that would change all of their lives forever. When they first reached their destination, they first had to deal with Anderson's security force. These were men whose cruelty and loyalty to Anderson far outweighed their skill in combat. While they may have felt powerful when tormenting starving, injured factory workers, they were quickly routed and slaughtered by 05-1 and his team. When they ventured inside the factory, they were utterly appalled by what they saw. The inhuman conditions faced by Anderson's thousands of victims drove them into a blood-curdling, murderous rage. Almost half of 05-1's men were lost in the battle against Anderson's army of engineered monsters, but in the end, they prevailed. Nothing would stop them in their quest for liberation and vengeance on behalf of all that this terrible place had tormented. They fought their way to Anderson's office, where they found him cowering under his desk. For a man as despicable as Anderson, only a truly medieval execution would suffice. 05-1 and his men hanged, drew, and quartered Anderson over a period of 2 days. The sadistic madman died laughing in the end, saying that while they may kill him, his factory will never die. But the factory was no longer his. In addition to the factory's horrors, 05-1 and his men also discovered its wonders. It wasn't just normal items and monsters that the factory produced. They were also thanks to some of Anderson's arcane deals, the world's leading producer of anomalous items. Skeletal horses that never tire, shadow cloaks that could transport the wearer to different dimensions, toy guns that fire real bullets, even yo-yos that could flay the skin from anyone they touched. These were anomalous objects that could shift the balance of global power, items that could give them an advantage against the things that go bump in the night. While others among them were greedy or fearful, the inner circle of 05-1 were united in a singular purpose. Using the anomalous, they can control to contain the anomalous that they can't. This group took over the factory, making it Site Alpha, their first ever containment facility, and came to be known as the 05 Council. With funding that came from a mix of blackmail and friends in high places, this organization, a burgeoning SCP Foundation, grew more and more powerful over the ensuing decades. The tools they gained from the factory were pivotal in the continued success of their mission, and as they discovered more anomalies, they also put these anomalies to good use. But in 1911, 05-1 and his new organization came up against an enemy that even the factory's tools couldn't help them defeat. A warrior race known as the Fae, so named because their only weakness seemed to be a vulnerability to iron. But these beings were an order of magnitude more powerful than humans, or the beasts they'd once faced in Anderson's factory. The Fae handed them defeat after defeat, but soon humiliation became decimation when an army of the Fae led an assault on the factory. It was a day that only 05-1 remembered. The Fae slaughtered everyone, every guard, every researcher, every member of the 05 Council. They swept through the factory like a plague of locusts, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. Only 05-1 escaped and survived, and that's only because he ran. As he fled from the fairy forces through the halls of the factory, he came upon a door he'd never seen before, a huge golden door covered in Aramaic script. He fled inside, entering the very heart of the factory. Inside, he saw the floating dead body of James Anderson, bathed in red light. Now he was little more than the mouthpiece of the factory itself, or rather the great and unknowable powers working behind it. The factory gave O5-1 an offer, just like the offer it had given Anderson before. It would give them the power to turn back time and destroy the Fae, saving everyone that they'd slain in the factory. But in exchange, all of them would forever belong to the factory. And in a moment of weakness and fear, O5-1 took the deal. The clock was turned back to before the battle. This time O5-1 and his compatriots, all of whom except him had no idea what had happened, had the horrific weapons required to slaughter the Fae. Weapons that nobody, mortal or otherwise, could possess. They repelled the invading force easily, but knowing the horrors that came before, O5-1 refused to stop there. With the power of the Foundation and the factory behind him, he hunted down and murdered every last fairy, driving their species entirely into extinction. As far as O5-1 was concerned, it was them or him. But with the Fae utterly destroyed and the Foundation's superiority assured, a shadow was laying over O5-1. He'd made a deal with the factory, and someday it would want its pound of flesh. O5-1, rather than facing the consequences of his actions, decided to run and hide. He had the factory decommissioned and buried under the rubble, never to be used as an active Foundation base again. But just because they were done with the factory doesn't mean that the factory was done with them. One day a toy gun appeared on O5-1's desk, a toy gun that fired real bullets, just like the ones they found in the factory a century before. The factory was still waiting for its repayment. With every anomalous item from the factory that the Foundation used, the terrible place only grew in its power. Since the resurgence, O5-1 has been sending the factory sacrifices, D-classes, dead and alive, as well as agents and researchers. But as time goes on, it seems that these sacrifices aren't satisfying the factory anymore. It wants more than O5-1 can ever stand to give it. And when O5-1 refuses to give, the factory will begin to take. And what the factory wants, sooner or later, the factory will get. Agent Kister was running for his life. Every breath had burned in his throat, like inhaling chlorine gas. He sped through the dark, surrounded by deafening metallic screams that bounced off the eternity of pipes scaling and strangling the walls around him. As far as he was concerned, this was what hell looked like. A nightmare boiler room that would somehow be less scary if Freddy Krueger was there, because at least there'd be some kind of recognizably human intelligence to reason with. The pipes, SCP-015, are truly unknowable. As an SCP Foundation Mobile Task Force member, Agent Kister had seen some truly horrific things in the line of duty. He'd been there during SCP-682 containment breaches, firing an assault rifle at the beast as its scales hardened into a bulletproof carapace. He'd seen the femur breaker used on some poor, godforsaken D-class to lure Uncle Larry back into the containment chamber for some midnight fun. In the most anxiety-inducing mission of his life, he'd once even bagged 096's weeping face after it slaughtered a whole mountain village. And these damn pipes were going to be the thing that killed him. He turned a sharp corner, trying to block out the screams of his teammates. 4 of them had been sent in. The rest were already dead, or worse. Stupid, stupid, stupid. They'd made a classic military mistake, underestimating the capabilities of their enemy. And in Agent Kister's experience, this had always been a capital offense. All to install that machine, that stupid little remote control reconnaissance vehicle. That's what they'd given their lives for. Agent Kister tried to blink away the memory of Agent Montgomery's face. Monty was the youngest member of the team, 28 years old, his first major mission into the heart of a skip. Kister wanted to remember him how he'd first seen him, a bright-eyed greenhorn, ready to protect the human race from the horrors that lay in the dark. But he'd been the first to go when everything got FUBAR. It was the smaller pipes that got Monty. 4 of them shot out, spearing his lungs and heart, pinning him in place. Even if they tried to cut him out, he would have been a goner. He coughed up blood and went ghost white faster than you'd ever imagine. Kister would never forget, for what little time he had left to live, the horrible sight of the light leaving that kid's eyes. And all this because one of them had tripped on one of the pipes on the way out and busted it. The mission was already done. What an awful, pointless way to die. Kister was yanked from his aching thoughts by a sudden obstacle in the way, a huge, towering pipe that looked like a pillar of flesh, covered in bulbous, staring eyes. The thought crossed his mind. Jesus, these pipes can really be made out of anything. He looked down and saw a series of rubber pipes slithering towards his feet along the ground like snakes. It was time to run again, but how long could you even run for when the very location around you wants you dead? They should have sent the mole rats for a job like this. The infinitely reconfiguring pipes changed the layout of the warehouse around him, making escape seem all the more unfeasible. That's when he started thinking about the terrible thing that happened to Agent Green. When 015 turned hostile, they needed to make a run for it fast. It wasn't unlike being a pathogen inside a living body. You start to make trouble, and the body's immune system is going to come for you. And one of the most common mechanisms for a body fighting a virus is a fever, a sudden increase in temperature that burns out the threat. The group turned and ran as the pipes started twisting towards them. Agent Green panicked and began striking at the pipes around him with his hands. The first instinct would have been to shoot, but no guns were permitted inside the SCP-015 warehouse. It reacted severely to any kind of tool being brought into its proximity. Several dead agents and researchers could tell you all about this if they hadn't made that same mistake. But when things were already going sideways, it left them defenseless. Agent Green was soon boxed in, caged by a latticework of pipes in varying sizes. He tried desperately to push them out of the way and make an escape route, but the hissing noise was getting louder and louder as the pipes started to turn a glowing red all around him. After all, when a body needs to deal with a hostile foreign object, it burns out the threat. Kister wished he could shake the awful high-pitched wail that Agent Green made while the heat inside his pipe cage became unbearable. It was like seeing a human get caught inside a giant bug zapper. His skin went black and charred, and soon after, the heat had risen to such an insane degree that Agent Green was reduced to little more than ash in his pipe furnace. But Kister couldn't afford to dwell. He kept running, vaulting over a long, ragged pipe made from stinking human hair. This terrible place stank of motor oil, mold, and death. But maybe those perceptions had been colored by the terrible things he'd seen here. There it was again, that awful choked screaming coming from inside the pipes. Agent Boggs. It was a nightmare to hear him shriek like that. Boggs had been one of the toughest men that Kister had ever met. He mentored him, back when he first became an MTF member. Having Boggs on the team meant experience. It meant safety. It meant that things would go okay. Kister had seen Boggs stare down some of the most horrifying skips imaginable and not even flinch. And yet, here he was, screaming and bawling like a hurt child in the pipes. Boggs was the next one to get taken. As he and Kister ran through the dark, trying to find a way out, they'd passed a huge pipe made of a soft foam-like substance. A seam in the side of the pipe had yawned open, and a tangle of writhing tentacles, each one barbed with thorns like the stem of a rosebush. They enveloped Agent Boggs, cutting into his weathered skin. He gasped in pain, unable to scream. It happened so fast. Before Kister even had a chance to grab him, he was pulled into the pipe, and the crevice sealed behind him. And that was when the screaming really started for poor Agent Boggs. Kister hoped for his sake that he would die sometime soon. Shrouded in the fog of his dark thoughts, Agent Kister turned a corner and felt cold, hard metal suddenly collide with his face, breaking his nose with an unpleasant crunch. He'd been clotheslined by a low pipe that hadn't been there before, and now he was laid out on his back, face humming with pain. Thoughts and feelings swam. He looked up into the seemingly infinite web of pipes weaving through the air above him. He was right earlier. He just knew it. The place was hell. It'd be his eternal resting place. Suddenly, a new, huge shape moved into the space above him. A pipe of ancient, rusty iron that looked older than even the warehouse holding this whole mess. Right above him, there was a huge valve fixed into the pipe's belly. He watched helpless as the valve opened itself with a squeal, and a huge dark mass came pouring out of it onto his body. A sudden weight, a sudden warmth, sound and movement, and tiny scratching claws. Rats. Thousands of big, hungry black rats with gnarled yellow teeth, clumps of fur purged from their skin by mange, big ropey worm-like tails swaying and whipping at the air. Who knows how long they'd been in that pipe? Who knows when these rats had eaten anything that wasn't their brothers and sisters? And here was Agent Kister, given unto them by the glorious pipes. The last thing he ever saw were those nasty yellow teeth, because they ate his eyes first. Word of the four disappeared, and presumed dead operatives soon reached Dr. Charles Ogden Gears, the legendarily taciturn senior researcher that managed the SCP-015 project, among a myriad of others. His face didn't betray a flicker of emotion when he was informed about the men lost to SCP-015. It wasn't that he didn't feel for them, more that he deemed it both unproductive and unprofessional to dwell on the deaths of personnel when carrying out their duties. After all, being killed by an anomaly was simply an occupational hazard, and a generous stipend would be sent to their families to compensate for their tragic loss. Dr. Gears simply asked, "Was the mission successful in spite of the casualties? Did the team manage to install the modular robotic vehicle at the epicenter?" He was told that the MRV had been successfully installed at least. Dr. Gears nodded and began scheduling a second exploratory mission for a few months in the future to check the status of the machine. Still, in the meantime, the MRV would chug along, doing what humans couldn't, or perhaps shouldn't, do within the nightmarish mess of ever-growing pipes. It would roll through, collecting information on everything around it, hopefully giving the SCP Foundation an inroad to mapping the whole thing, without needing to send a cavalcade of staff into the danger zone, just to discover more about these peculiar pipes. Sure, some lives were lost getting in there, but this measure would likely save even more lives in the long run. That was, until something went wrong. The exact nature of what happened to the MRV inside the domain of pipes was a mystery, but it wasn't doing its intended job, and the SCP Foundation needed to find out why. The second exploratory mission was required much sooner than they'd initially anticipated, with a dual purpose: collecting the readings and finding out what exactly had happened to the MRV in the first place. He included a more specific set of instructions for the next mission. Only 3 members of personnel to enter SCP-015 this time, to minimize potential loss. 1 trained technician to collect and read the diagnostics, and 2 guards to maintain discipline and safety under pressure. With a setup like that, what could possibly go wrong? Dr. Gears' various assistants began headhunting the perfect team for the job. Junior researcher Lon, wanting to prove herself and climb up the ranks, put her name forward. She was young, intelligent, and had the initiative to get the job done. Though there was one thing that she hadn't disclosed when she was applying for this important new position. Junior researcher Lon suffered from claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. Then the hunt was on for the 2 members of Foundation military personnel who'd escort Lon to the MRV to take the readings. Like the 2 priests in The Exorcist, they decided to recruit 1 grizzled, experienced operative and 1 extremely cautious young buck straight out of the Foundation MTF Training Academy. The younger of the 2 operatives, codenamed Agent 2, was careful and conscientious to a fault. He did things by the book, or not at all. The older operative, codenamed Agent 6, was quite the opposite. He'd done this job long enough to operate solely on instinct, and resented his employers for expecting him to approach his missions any other way. Lon, Agent 2, and Agent 6. The team was assembled, and when the time came, they were taken to SCP-015 to execute their mission. It should have been simple enough. Get in, collect the readings, and get back out. Though a few weeks earlier, the same thing would have been said for the mission to install the MRV, which left for Mobile Task Force operatives dead or worse. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed when it came to SCP-015. They were only allowed flashlights inside. Anything else carried a substantial risk of activating SCP-015's defensive state, putting all of their lives in jeopardy. Lon had tried to keep things light, masking her own terrible fear at this strange new situation. She joked that perhaps the three of them should get Mario hats, seeing as they were plumbers now. Agent 2 happily laughed along, suggesting that perhaps he should be Luigi. Agent 6 was utterly unamused by this whole situation and wanted no part of it, which is honestly just so Wario of him. They followed along a carefully mapped route through the pipes, being careful not to touch any of them. After all, you never know what could set SCP-015 off. Agent 6 didn't share in their merriment or their concern. In fact, he had contempt for them and this whole situation. He thought Lon and Agent 2 were a pair of frightened, skittish children, willing to buy whatever Foundation-assigned bull honky they were given. He didn't believe that SCP-015 was anywhere near as dangerous as they'd been told. In all likelihood, knowing the eggheads up top, they just didn't want men of action like him breaking any of their precious little toys while conducting missions on their behalf. This whole thing was a big, stupid joke. As they ducked and weaved through the confines of SCP-015, the tensions between them all just silently grew. Their flashlights played among the pipes, revealing the insane variety of shapes, sizes, compositions, and materials in here. Wood, steel, flesh, bone, glass, pressed ash, granite, and so much more. And yet there were no pipes comprised of any standard pipe-making material, like lead, PVC plastic, or copper. It was undeniably freaky, but when you work with SCPs for long enough, you learn to stop asking questions about the more minor forms of strangeness inherent to anomalies. The composition only got narrower as they delved deeper into the warehouse. Lon felt the anxiety, like a hand gripping her throat and squeezing, but tried still to keep it hidden. Agent 6, the largest among them, almost got stuck a few times, trying to crawl into spaces too tight for him to fit. He felt like murdering Lon when she threw out a casual comparison to Winnie the Pooh in the process. When they reached the MRV, it gave them an ounce of momentary relief. The journey was halfway done. But the comfort was quickly squashed by seeing what had actually happened to the MRV. It had been speared by a pipe, and new pipes had grown through and out of it, effectively rooting it in place. This caused immediate debate among the group around one key issue. Did this mean that the MRV was now technically part of the pipes? And by extension, would the pipes feel the need to defend themselves if the databanks were removed from the MRV in order to deliver the readings back to the researchers at Site-17? While Lon and Agent 2 carefully discussed the issue, Agent 6 lost his temper and decided to show these two foolish kids how it was done. He claimed the two of them were worrying about a bunch of Foundation hooey that they were inexperienced and gullible enough to believe, as if this bunch of weird pipes was actually dangerous. It was like how every 6 anomalies there's apparently one capable of ending the world. It's all a bunch of overblown, fear-mongering nonsense. And to prove that he wasn't just all talk on this front, Agent 6 pried open the top of the MRV and slid out the data cards, which seemed to be covered in some kind of viscous, unpleasant liquid from the pipes that had penetrated the device. Still, he'd gotten what they came for. He could have done this whole thing alone without this pair of bedwetters. He scoffed and said, "Kids, I don't know how you two survive." But he shouldn't have spoken so soon. The large pipe that he didn't even realize he was standing on opened up beneath his feet, and seconds later he was immersed up to his shoulders in it. 6 began to let out the most horrifying shrieks you've ever heard, and when Agent 2 and Lon ran over to try and help him out, they realized why. The pipe below Agent 6 was filled with flowing molten iron. By the time they pulled Agent 6 out, well, Agent 6 from the shoulders up, considering that that was all that was left, he was already dead. And despite the actual aggressor being destroyed, SCP-015 wasn't done. It was ready to clean house. As Agent 2 and Lon attempted to flee, some eye-level pipes around them burst, firing crystallized glass into their faces, cutting into their skin and eyes. But they needed to push on, despite the pain, if they wanted to survive and get out. The two of them ran, horrifying noises of twisting and bursting pipes roaring behind them. Pipes made of thorns and bones started to grow, blocking off their exits until they were trapped. Lon, utilizing her small frame, was able to crawl through a gap in the pipes into an adjoining chamber. 2 was given a horrifying surprise when a pipe burst near his hand, showering his flesh in thick, corrosive gunk. His hand melted away at the wrist. As Lon called for help in the tiny cramped chamber she was locked in, Two ran off to try and find an exit where he could bring more people in to help them, but it would already be too late for poor Lon. A thick, honey-like substance began bleeding into the chamber, disgusting in its overpowering saccharine flavor and goopy, viscous thickness. The chamber seemed to get smaller and smaller as Lon screamed as the honey level rose. Eventually, it got higher than her mouth and nose could reach. She gave a horrifying final gurgle, and then she was gone, entombed forever between the pipes. Agent 2 kept running. His flashlight was beginning to die, but he didn't care. As his eyes bled from the splinters of glass and what was left of his hand dripped from the jagged nub of his wrist, all he could do was keep moving forwards. He panted and screamed and stumbled in the dark until he tripped on something he didn't notice and pitched forwards. He tumbled into the gaping maw of a nearby pipe, surrounded by unseeable, unknowable ooze. As he tumbled further down into the seemingly infinite darkness, it was too dark to see and too cramped to move anywhere but straight down. All he could do was scream and scream and scream, until his voice was hoarse and his throat bled, though nobody was there to even hear his cries. Days later, when his skin started to shred off, it was almost welcome. Dr. Gears would later receive the news of this tragically failed mission, and the 3 operatives now declared MIA because of it. He sighed and wrote up his report on the matter, closing with the sentence, "Data deemed non-vital in light of lost staff. SCP-015 classification level review suggested."
It goes without saying that the SCP Foundation archives are filled with some terrifying monsters. Even the deadliest creatures can, in theory, be defeated, or at least soundly avoided. After all, they're just flesh and blood, or in some cases, metal or concrete. But what if reality as you know it one day just broke? Or worse, you were transported to a reality so frightening and alien to our own that death seemed like the only escape, but you couldn't even give yourself that. This brings us to today's topic, the terrifying alternate reality of SCP-3001. The Foundation is no stranger to freaky alternate dimensions, but what was experienced by Joint Lead Researcher Dr. Robert Scranton at Site-120 is a truly unique nightmare. Co-managed by his wife, Dr. Anna Lang, Site-120 is a facility largely designated for research into SCPs with dangerous reality warping capabilities in order to mitigate future containment breaches. Reality warpers are among some of the more perplexing and dangerous SCPs, from the pocket dimension creating SCP-106 to the SCP creating Dr. Wondertainment and everything in between. Scranton and Lang's goal to further study such entities was an admirable one, if a little overambitious. And on January 2, 2000, during the testing of a new technology created by the Foundation's leading power couple, disaster finally struck. Scranton and Lang had already been the brains behind one of the Foundation's most valuable tools in the fight against reality-bending SCPs, the Scranton Reality Anchors. Their follow-up, the Lang-Scranton Stabilizer, or LSS, likely would have been an even more advanced variant of their earlier invention, and should have been a huge success for the team. But things didn't turn out that way. Dr. Scranton and several other researchers were gathered in Reality Lab A performing routine tests on the LSS prototypes. While other technicians ran diagnostics tests, Scranton stood at the control panel, the blinking red light above the console confirming that everything was going according to plan. But as anyone who's fallen victim to one of the Foundation's many anomalies will tell you, just because you've done everything correctly doesn't mean you're safe. Scranton began operating the machine, not knowing that something was rumbling up towards him from below. Without warning, a sudden, unexpected burst of seismic activity rocked the entire base. Researchers grabbed onto whatever was closest as the world shook around them. In his panic, Dr. Scranton clung to the LSS control panel as the seismic blast fried the circuits and kicked it into overdrive. There was a blast of magnificent blinding light, and when the rumbling stopped, not only was the doctor gone, he had been erased from reality as we know it. The earthquake had caused a deadly malfunction in the machine meant to stabilize reality, and instead tore a rift in it, dragging the unfortunate doctor and the control panel into oblivion. His wife, Dr. Lang, and the many researchers who idolized him were devastated by his unexpected demise at the hand of what should have been his crowning achievement. The one silver lining was that this reality-ripping event had almost definitely eliminated the doctor quickly and painlessly. As far as the Foundation and his loved ones were concerned, Scranton's death had been immediate and complete. a luxury afforded to few Foundation employees who die anomalous deaths. But sadly, that isn't how Dr. Scranton's story, or the story of SCP-3001, ends. No, this is where it all begins. How do we know all this? In the hellish new place where Scranton had been transported, the control panel from the LSS that he'd been clinging to for dear life had been transported with him and continued to record audio data from this anomalous location. Not that Dr. Scranton realized it, not at first anyway. As far as he knew, he'd suddenly been transported into a pitch-black location. No sights, no sounds, no sense. True nothingness. At first, the doctor was confused. One second he was testing out his new technology, and the next he was quite literally nowhere. In spite of his current situation, the doctor was still an intelligent and rational man. He took a moment to compose himself, hoping that in time his eyes would adjust to the new darkness around him. But that moment never came. The darkness remained perfectly absolute. Much like the darkness in another reality-defying SCP, the deadly endless staircase known as SCP-087, the dark seemed thick, almost like you could touch it. The doctor, not wanting to give himself to despair and die in this impossible place, and with no other options seemingly available, began walking. Either he'd find his way out, or the Foundation would find him. No need to panic. It may have altered the doctor's temperament if he knew that the Foundation already assumed he was dead, and that no search party was going to come looking for him. Still, logic dictates that if a person walks for long enough, they're bound to find something. The problem Scranton was about to face was that SCP-3001 doesn't run by any kind of conventional logic. He walked and walked and walked, but he didn't seem to get any nearer to or farther from anything. But how could he even know? After all, in total darkness, there aren't any landmarks to assist in navigation. The doctor walked and paced and screamed for days on end, but he made no progress. He was alone in an empty world. He had no choice though, so he kept walking and walking and walking for 11 days. During that time, he felt his hunger and thirst grow. He was in terrible pain from a mix of starvation and dehydration, but the release of death didn't seem to come for him. He was going to have to learn the rules of this new place the hard way, and it grimly dawned on Dr. Scranton that dying in this place might not even be the worst possible outcome. He paced and repeated facts to himself, hoping to ground himself in the moment and avoid the panic that could so easily set in. Name, Robert Scranton. Age, 39. Birthday, September 19th, 1961. Favorite color, blue. Favorite song, Living on a Prayer. Wife, Anna. Little by little, the words seemed to turn to nonsense in his mouth as the terror grew. Just as he felt like he was about to lose his mind, he noticed something. A small oasis in the endless darkness of SCP-3001. The glowing red light on the LSS control panel. Where had it come from? And how was it still recording? The doctor had no idea, but he was grateful for any kind of familiarity in this strange darkness around him. Perhaps the LSS could be the key to saving him, or at least figuring out what on earth was going on here. Whatever the case, there was no denying that having the panel here was better than nothing. At least, when it was found, if it was ever found, then people would know what had happened to him. As the days passed and he continued to mysteriously survive, Dr. Scranton deduced that one didn't need food or water to survive continually in SCP-3001. The location had an anomalous effect on its inhabitants. As the days passed and turned to weeks of wandering in the darkness, Dr. Scranton further deduced that he was no longer in his home dimension. This was an entirely separate pocket dimension, much like the one possessed by SCP-106, but featureless, a perfect self-contained void. Now dimly illuminated by the red light of the panel, Dr. Scranton explored further into the void around him. He traveled for months on end, the pain of his deficiencies growing by the day, but found he was getting nowhere. All things considered, he wasn't even sure he was moving, or whether reality and darkness were swirling around him like a thick liquid. Rather than walking on a single flat surface, he was moving in all directions across a three-dimensional plane. The space-time continuum appeared to be entirely broken here, where movement is more defined by the conscious intention to move than any real geographical repositioning. Dr. Scranton knew that this place broke every single one of Kijel's laws of reality parameters. And from his years working with a plethora of reality warpers in Site-120, he had a theory for why this pocket dimension was so strange. It had an extraordinarily weak Hume field. Before we get back to Dr. Scranton's semi-living nightmare, we need a quick primer on Hume theory and why having a weak Hume field is such a problem. A Hume is a unit of measurement for the strength and amount of reality in a given location or being. In an area with an incredibly low Hume field relative to our world, such as SCP-3001, universe breaches and anomalous incidents rise significantly. At the time of his being trapped there, SCP-3001 had the lowest number of Humes in any recorded environment, making it a phenomenally anomalous zone. It was for this reason that starvation and dehydration never took hold of him despite causing him great pain. And the worst by far was yet to come. Dr. Scranton wasn't trapped in this dimension for weeks or even months. He was trapped in the darkness for years, and it took a nightmarish toll on his body and mind. The small flashing red light on his LSS control panel became his only friend, and as the years drew on, he would hold entire conversations with his only source of illumination. He knew that his days were numbered. If he didn't escape the dimension within around 3 years, the Hume field would diffuse further, and he would be left in a truly horrific state. But based on how little headway he'd made in the time he'd been there, he didn't feel optimistic. He kept speaking into the recorder, if only to break the silence and prevent him from going completely insane. But even that would only hold it off for so long. Alone and talking to himself endlessly in the darkness, Dr. Scranton could feel his mind slipping as the confines of the pocket dimension constricted and his body began to change. The low Hume field slowly diffused his physical matter, destroying the physical integrity of his body, but never being merciful enough to actually let him die. In his haunting audio logs, the doctor described his hands as diffusing and thinning out like spiderwebs. Over time, there was less and less of him, and what was left wasn't entirely human. As Scranton's Hume level lowered to equalize with that of SCP-3001, the lines between his body and the LSS control console began to blur in a twisted marriage of warped flesh and machine. The Lang-Scranton stabilizer was anything but stable. Before his mind and body became something else entirely, the doctor still had the presence of mind to finally realize how he'd come to be in this terrible place. The LSS had opened a wormhole known as a Class C broken entry into a paradoxical pocket dimension between layers of reality and taken him through it. He'd slipped through a crack in reality into absolute darkness, and now he was stuck with a fate far worse than death. How do we know any of this? Much like the event in the first place, it's a total accident. Testing superior reality-bending technology almost 6 years after the disappearance caused the sudden return of the missing LSS to Site-120's reality labs. The only trace of Dr. Scranton that it brought back with it was the blood and viscera that coated the console, much to the abject horror of his still grieving wife, Dr. Anna Lang. To this day, Dr. Scranton, formerly one of the Foundation's brightest minds, remains trapped in the nightmare of SCP-3001. His current condition, whether the Doctor is still alive after 20 years of being warped by the low Hume field of 3001's darkened confines, is still unknown. But for the Doctor's own sake, we hope he's been dead for quite some time, because few things on Earth are as horrifying as the alternative.
If you're familiar with the SCP Foundation, then you already know the exact reason why there are multiple SCP-001s. You may even think you know which of them is the real SCP-001. But for those of you who are new here, or who just need a little reminder, the designation of SCP-001 doesn't refer to a single creature, object, or entity, but rather a collection of various anomalies that are apparently kept in containment by the SCP Foundation. At present, it is unclear why there are multiple files collected under the shared designation of SCP-001. Some believe it is because these anomalies are some of the earliest ever contained by the Foundation. This would mean that they share the designation of SCP-001, as they were likely encountered before the SCP Foundation introduced their current numbering system. However, there also exists a theory that this is nothing more than intentional misdirection. Perhaps the multiple SCP-001 files are an attempt by the Foundation to conceal information about the true SCP-001. After all, it wouldn't be the first time this hyper-secretive organization deceived us. Anomalies sharing the name SCP-001 include the infamous Scarlet King, the massive Gate Guardian, and the world-ending event known as When Day Breaks. But today we'll be using SCP-001 to refer not to an entity or an event, but to a location. a location codenamed God's Blind Spot. Located in an unassuming corner of the world is a site that the SCP Foundation constructed and designated as Facility T. According to their archive, it's a largely unremarkable place, situated at a spot on the Sinai Peninsula, which is a part of Egypt that forms a bridge between the continents of Africa and Asia. In the 18th century, archaeologists excavating the area uncovered the remains of a stone structure believed to be an inn that dates back to the 2nd millennium BC. However, since the construction of Facility T, any trace of this structure has since disappeared. So, what makes this unremarkable site so important to the SCP Foundation? Why establish a facility if there was nothing anomalous about its nature? What distinguishes this SCP-001 site in the eyes of the Foundation is the area's profound lack of any ambient IKEA radiation. But what is IKEA radiation? Well, according to the Foundation's researchers, it's a form of cosmic background radiation, one that's not overtly harmful to human beings. If you grew up in a strict church-going household, then it's highly likely you would have been exposed to a lot of this non-electromagnetic radiation and never even realized it. You see, the thing with IKEA radiation is that it is directly correlated with the amount of religious faith a person has. Regardless of which religion someone follows, IKEA radiation will form around them. It tends to be harmless to humans. However, certain anomalous entities and SCPs considered to be demonic in nature can be repelled and even fought off with high levels of IKEA radiation. The presence of other powerful anomalies, those considered more benign or even holy, can also create an increase in this radiation. SCP-001 has earned the nickname God's Blind Spot for a number of reasons, one being that it is the only place on Earth with a natural absence of this IKEA radiation. The Foundation has conducted experiments that involve bringing sources known to emit IKEA radiation into the area of SCP-001, but when they measured, no change in radiation levels was detected, meaning that the space around Facility T does not actively block IKEA radiation from entering it, but also cannot absorb or retain this religious radiation. It might be more accurate to say that the location destroys any trace of residual IKEA without damaging the source. A lack of faith-field radiation is far from the only anomalous property of SCP-001 though. During a number of tests involving D-Class personnel, the Foundation witnessed that, while in the area, it also becomes impossible for the death of any human being to occur, a discovery that obviously needed to be researched further. The first test involved a healthy human male who was left in a containment cell on the SCP-001 site and observed. He had no supplies, no food, no water, yet over 120 days this man stayed alive, never succumbing to starvation or dehydration. Next, a female member of D-Class was exposed to a lethal dose of cyanide gas within Facility T, and suffered none of the expected effects. Foundation researchers then repeated this cyanide gas test using 30 common brown rats, all of which were killed, proving that it was only humans that couldn't be killed while within SCP-001. God's Blind Spot seems to also be able to slow or halt the effects of terminal illnesses, as proven when a D-Class with stage 4 cancer was brought into SCP-001. Despite her prognosis stating that she would be dead imminently, the woman survived in the area for almost 800 days. Her cancer symptoms never advanced, and she only died after finally leaving the area of SCP-001. There are limitations to this anomalous effect though. One test involved cremating a healthy male D-Class while he was still alive. The man's body caught fire just as you would expect it to, and he was burned to death. According to the findings of that test and similar variations, Foundation researchers have learned that the life-preserving qualities of SCP-001 don't prevent death by extreme external damage. One of the final tests to take place within SCP-001 involved a pair of 24-year-old identical D-Class twins. One of the twins, designated Twin A, was held at Facility T, while the other, Twin B, was imprisoned in a cell at a different Foundation site. After observing them for over 26 years, Twin B aged naturally to the age of 50.
His twin, however, did not appear to age at all over the course of 2.5 decades. It was only when moved to another facility that Twin A began to show signs of aging. The aging process for Twin A was rapid too, and eventually he caught up with his brother. Being a benign, non-threatening anomaly, the Foundation has been more than happy to use God's blind spot to their own advantage. Facility T was specifically established on this site to house the headquarters of the O5 Council, the overseers of the entire SCP Foundation. It's hardly surprising that the Overseer Council would want to set up shop here. After all, it's the one spot on planet Earth where no human being can ever die of natural causes, and will not age for the duration of their stay. Of course, this locked the O5 Council to one location, but what if they could replicate the effects of SCP-001 elsewhere? Of course, this is what the SCP Foundation attempted, following their research into God's blind spot. The Foundation's own Dr. Marvin Scranton attempted to artificially recreate the area's anomalous effects somewhere else. His hope was, by generating a vacuum of IKEA radiation, that a second instance of SCP-001 would occur at a location of his choosing. Or, as his assistant Bertrand put it, they planned to build a box and then push God out of it. As it turned out, God had other plans. Dr. Scranton quickly realized the hubris of his scheme. The IKEA radiation in the selected area rapidly dropped to 0, just as planned. But then something unexpected happened. Scranton detected an increase in Humes. These are essentially parts of the fabric of reality, and are what's often disrupted by reality-bending SCPs. Something had come into our world thanks to the O5 Council's attempt to recreate SCP-001. Something impossible for the Foundation to measure or observe. In other words, Scranton had no idea what he unleashed, or where it went. Following this incident, the O5 Council realized a worrying increase in the anomalous incidents they were encountering. Whether or not this came as a direct result of their meddling with the fabric of the universe was unclear, but it forced the Council to reconsider the focus and direction of the entire SCP Foundation. Up until this point, they had been an organization focused purely on research, but now they had to embrace a new approach to how they handled anomalies. From then on, the Foundation's objective became to actively seek out and contain anomalous entities, creatures, objects, and locations like SCP-001. Rather than just observing these phenomena for study, they would secure, contain, and protect. The final portion of SCP-001's file is a memorandum detailing an arrangement between the O5 Council and an unknown counterparty. In the document, someone named Sheldon Katz set out revised terms for the Foundation's continued use of Facility T. Sheldon states that he has reached an understanding with the counterparty, and that the contents of the document are to serve as a formal agreement, a contract of sorts between the SCP Foundation and someone else. According to this contract, the incident with Scranton put a strain on the relationship between the Foundation and whoever the counterparty is, and that the O5 Council are seeking to make amends in order to continue their new goal of collecting and containing anomalies. So who was this counterparty that the Overseer Council was so desperate to appease and have on their side? Who could possibly be a higher power than the most powerful secret organization on Earth? Well, an actual higher power, of course. That's right. The O5 Council was making a deal with God over how they were allowed to use his blind spot, or at least a very powerful being that considers itself to be God. The rules laid out on their agreement stated that no person was permitted to stay at the site of SCP-001 for more than 120 years, including members of the O5 Council, along with other members of Foundation staff, management, researchers, security personnel, and test subjects. Additionally, the SCP Foundation's Ethics Committee was required to annually report any and all of the O5 Council's decisions to God. For his own part, God was restricted from smiting or exacting his terrible wrath upon any member of Foundation personnel. That's right. A perk of working for the SCP Foundation is getting around-the-clock divine protection, at least from God himself. That's still a lot better than an employee dental plan.
This came with a condition, however, that anyone committing a transgression or mortal sin was given a 90-day written notice and an opportunity to repent their wrongdoing. In return, God demanded that members of the Foundation only worshipped Him and no other divine entities. I, the Lord, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, was written in the contract. Finally, the agreement between the O5 Council and God was that they would work together. The Foundation and the counterparty would be equal partners when it came to the containment of SCPs and anomalies. Of all the strange and unexplained phenomena that the SCP Foundation encounters on a regular basis, it hardly comes as much of a surprise that they've got a direct line to the big guy upstairs, or at least one who purports to be. Still, the fact that the O5 Council have a business arrangement with an ultra-powerful deity-like being and express written permission to use his blind spot where no person can die or age is hardly a comforting thought. At least the SCP Foundation only ever uses its power for good, right?
The first thing that tips the Foundation off to SCP-087's presence were the reports of numerous unexplained disappearances on campus. There were plenty of rumors about what might be behind them, but field agents suspected that the true source of the vanishing would be something beyond civilian imagination. All anyone knew for sure was that everyone who had gone missing was last seen in a certain administrative building on the university grounds, and that the disappearances only seemed to happen when the elevator was out. The campus was soon flooded with Foundation agents, creating a barrier around the administrative building and the presumed habitat of SCP-087. Nobody else could get in, and hopefully whatever was inside couldn't get out. One of the Foundation's lead scientists was flown in to consult on the investigation. What could have been behind those students disappearing? The doctor's preliminary interviews with university staff who worked in the building yielded some interesting details. Strange noises, like banging and even a faint, shrill crying, would be heard from a door that led to a no longer used stairway in hallway 3B. Staff in the building had no reason to ever take these stairs, especially considering how many of them reported a strange sense of unease when just standing outside the dorm. The only reason someone might take those stairs is due to elevator malfunctions. In that instant, the doctor had put it all together. The staff they interviewed had their memory wiped with amnestics, special chemicals used by the Foundation with the power to delete human memories. The Foundation only used them for staff or civilians who had confirmed contact with an SCP, and the doctor knew that they had a live one on their hands. The staircase. There was something terribly wrong with that staircase, and it was the SCP Foundation's job to find out what, before it made anybody else disappear. This is the story of SCP-087, otherwise known as the Endless Staircase, and the 3 doomed journeys down into its murky depths. The doctor was more than eager to begin research into the staircase and its frightening, anomalous properties. After all, you don't claw your way up to being one of the Foundation's key researchers without being brave, and perhaps just a little bit deranged. As was standard, once a perimeter was secured around the staircase, the good doctor requested a selection of D-Class personnel for testing. For those not in the know, D-Class is the Foundation's polite way of saying cannon fodder. The doctor was sent 3 D-Class prisoners for use in his investigation of SCP-087. The first, D-8432, was, according to official documentation on the incident, a 43-year-old male of average build and appearance and unremarkable psychological background. This man once worked for the Foundation in a more official capacity, but he was given the often deadly demotion to D-Class due to a dangerous mistake handling SCP-682 that led to the deaths of several other agents. Now, it looked like it would be his turn. The doctor explained his mission to him: explore the staircase, gather data, help us find out exactly what we're dealing with here. If you come back alive, there may even be a promotion in it for you. And with that promise, D-8432 was given his loadout, a 75-watt flood lamp with battery power capable of lasting 24 hours, an audio headset, and a handheld camcorder fitted with a transmission stream, and an audio headset that would allow him to communicate with Dr. Bright. D-8432 was then pushed through the door in hallway 3B and out onto the staircase. According to declassified Foundation files describing the staircase, SCP-087 is an unlit platform staircase. Stairs descend on a 38-degree angle for 13 steps before reaching a semicircular platform of approximately 3 meters in diameter. Descent direction rotates 180 degrees at each platform. The design of SCP-087 limits subjects to a visual range of approximately 1.5 flights. But in D8432's mind, unlit really didn't seem like the right word. He would have chosen all-consuming darkness. Despite carrying a powerful 75-watt lamp, D8432 was only capable of partially lighting the platform he was standing on, and the illumination only stretched down 9 of the 13 steps to the next platform. When D8432 observed how little help his lamp was giving him, he was instructed to shine it out of the doorway into hallway 3B. When he did so, the light seemed to shine far further than it ever could in SCP-087. Already, the beginning of the anomalous activity was obvious. Everywhere else, darkness is just the absence of light. In SCP-087, darkness eats light. It was like a tangible black mass that only a certain amount of light could survive, while the rest just wouldn't show. D8432 swallowed hard over a lump in his throat. The door to hallway 3B was closed behind him, and he was ordered to descend. Surviving to see that promotion was feeling unlikely, but it's not like he had a choice. If he tried to escape SCP-087 before he was permitted, he'd be shot by SCP Foundation field agents on the spot. So he followed the high-ranking doctor's orders and began to descend the steps to the next platform. Nothing about the physical makeup of the staircase itself seemed abnormal. The base and walls were a very plain, dull concrete with a metal handrail. The only thing that seemed unique about it so far was the strange light-bending properties. That was, until he reached the second platform down and he heard it, a soft, echoing cry. A child's cry. It was shrieks of panic, or maybe even pain, echoing up from below. He was asked why he had stopped, and he explained the crying sound he'd been hearing. It sounded like it was coming from far down the stairs, maybe 200 meters below him. He could just make out the words, "please," "help," and "down here," coming from the darkness. But the team outside the stairwell couldn't hear anything, so they asked him to descend further. Another platform down, and they could hear it too, the unmistakable cries of a terrified child. "Please, help," and "down here." D8432 was ordered to keep going, and only stop if he noticed changes to the visual environment or in the sounds he was hearing. D8432, knowing his life was on the line, had to keep going, and descended another 20 flights of stairs before stopping to remark that the sounds of the child hadn't gotten any closer. They still sounded just as far away as when he'd first heard them. He was told his observations were noted and pressured to continue. Within half an hour, D8432 had descended a full 50 floors, with no sign of a bottom in sight. Somehow, the volume of the child's crying had remained consistent throughout, as if it was moving away from D8432 at the same rate he was descending. At this point, D8432 reported that he was feeling uneasy. The doctor said that this was understandable, given the circumstances. He'd been watching what little there was to see over a live video feed the entire time, and something about the truly bottomless nature of the staircase and the ever-elusive crying was undeniably eerie. But things were about to really take a turn for the worst. As D8432 stepped forward towards the next set of stairs, he froze. There was something on the platform below him, barely illuminated by the light of his 75-watt bulb. It was a face, vaguely human in size and shape, but with a few terrifying differences. It had grayish skin and no mouth, nostrils, or pupils. And yet, D8432 could feel that this thing was making eye contact with him. He couldn't move, trapped in the thing's piercing gaze. In an instant, the face jerked forwards, suddenly only about a foot away from D432's face, eyes staring into its own. D8432 screamed and ran, scaling all 50 flights in an astonishing 18 minutes before charging out into hallway 3B. There, he collapsed from the exhaustion and the fear of what he'd just seen. Upon reviewing the footage, the strange face was designated SCP-087-1. Fascinating. It was time for a second experiment. The doctor just had to know more. The second test subject was D9035, a 28-year-old male with a history of aggravated assaults against women. He was given the same loadout as his predecessors, except this time with an even more powerful 100-watt bulb. He was also given 100 small LED lights that had adhesive backs and a battery life of approximately 3 weeks, with which they intended to permanently illuminate SCP-087. However, despite the extra wattage of his bulb, he still couldn't illuminate beyond the 9th step. SCP-087 wouldn't allow it. Having no ideas of the horrors that lurked below him, he descended on the doctor's orders and began fixing the LEDs to the walls of each platform he passed. The LED always illuminated the landing, but the light couldn't pass the first step on either side. The flights of stairs themselves would remain in perpetual darkness. After the second flight, D9035 noticed the same crying D8432 had heard and became uneasy. Just like before, as D9035 descended, the volume of the crying didn't seem to increase, as if for every step he descended, the source of the crying descended 1, 2, keeping them at a constant 200 meters apart. Still, he was ordered to continue his descent and the placing of LEDs even as his paranoia grew. When he reached the 51st floor, he observed damage to the wall and steps. Sections appeared to have been smashed to rubble by an extreme force. As he descended past the broken step, he only felt his fear, anxiety, and paranoia grow. The doctor made note of the fact that SCP-087 seemed to cause instances of anxiety and terror in its occupants, even before they encountered SCP-087-1. As D9035 reached Platform 89, a full 350 meters under the initial platform, he stopped dead in his tracks and saw something staring up at him from the platform below. That same terrible gray face with those dead, white eyes. He was encouraged to stay calm and try to get better footage of the face, but it charged for him, and D9035 ran for his life. He ascended the staircase at a staggering pace, even passing out from exhaustion and remaining motionless for 14 minutes halfway. When D9035 finally gathered the strength to get up, he scrambled back to hallway 3B and fell into a state of catatonia. He remains unresponsive to all external stimuli to this day, just staring off into the distance with a haunted expression, almost like he's still there in the hallway. The doctor wanted to conduct one more test before he ordered SCP-087 shut off from the world forever. And it was the most terrifying of all. The final subject was D9884, a 23-year-old woman with a history of depression and use of excessive force. The doctor had hoped that D9884 would travel the deepest yet, and so he gave her the additional supplies of a backpack containing 3.75 liters of water, 15 nutrient bars, and 1 thermal blanket. As far as the Foundation was concerned, she was in this for the long haul. But none of them had any idea quite how right they were. When D9884 entered SCP-087, all the lights from the previous expedition had disappeared. Still, she was ordered to go deeper. She heard the crying of the mysterious child, if it was even a child at all, and again she was ordered to go deeper. At the 496th landing, even as D9884 seemed to slip into a state of mortal terror, once again she was ordered to go even deeper. Every moment, he was hoping to get a better look at the face of SCP-087-1, and when D9884 finally broke and fled back upstairs, he did. The face appeared, but this time, it was mere inches behind her, staring directly into the camera with its blank eyes, startling even this veteran of the supernatural. The face appearing caused D9884 to panic and flee, but instead of going back up the stairs to safety, she went deeper down the staircase in an attempt to escape it, deeper and deeper and deeper, until her video feed cut out. D9884 was never seen again. In the aftermath of the tests, the SCP was classified as Euclid. It may have been dangerous, but at least it was easy to contain. The door to hallway 3B was replaced with one made out of reinforced steel with an electro-release lock mechanism. It has been disguised to resemble a janitorial closet consistent with the rest of the building. The lock won't release unless a classified number of electrical volts are applied, while the key is turned counterclockwise. And after a few inches of foam insulation were applied to the inner side of the door, staff at the building never again reported hearing strange noises. As for the fates of those lost within the endless turning flights and platforms of SCP-087, we may never know, but one can only assume it isn't pleasant. Agent Carla Mendoza was one of the best field agents that Site-41 had ever seen. She was professional, cool under pressure, and when the situation demanded it,
She could be a straight-up badass. During a Chaos Insurgency raid on the site, she'd single-handedly killed 4 different insurgents, the last one with her bare hands. During containment breaches, she'd always be the first one charging into the fray, her Foundation standard issue Beretta drawn and ready to fire. Agent Mendoza was so devoted to the job that she took up the site director's offer to start living on site, so she could always be there to help if an emergency situation unfolded. After all, when it all hits the fan, you want someone as utterly unshakable as Agent Mendoza on your side. The job had thrown the worst of the worst at her and she'd never even flinched. So surely nothing could scare Agent Mendoza, right? After a long day of kicking ass, taking names, and filling in the properly mandated amount of SCP Foundation debriefing paperwork, Agent Mendoza retired to her Site-41 quarters. She felt exhausted and sweaty, so before heading to bed to watch some wonderful SCP Explained videos on her phone, how kind, she decided to take a quick shower. The last thing she expected was for this particular shower to become, well, let's say, Hitchcockian. The water was running hot and clean, filling the air with steam. Agent Mendoza was lathering up her hair when she first heard the noise. Heavy, wheezing breaths coming from just behind the shower curtain. The second she heard it, Agent Mendoza felt a kind of brutal, crushing anxiety that she'd never experienced before. Like a hand was reaching into her chest and squeezing her heart. The self-defense training that had been encoded into her muscle memory over years of working at the Foundation kicked into effect. In a blind panic, she struck out at the shower curtain, causing it to sway outwards and land directly on the face of Mendoza's wheezing voyeur. Who or whatever it was standing right there, less than a meter away from the shower. The wheezing carved into Mendoza's ears like a butcher's knife. What an awful, monstrous sound. And despite the fact that the shower curtain obscured its face, she could still somehow see it. The way a defenseless animal can sense an approaching predator without ever locking eyes on it, and just somehow know that it's too late for them to escape now. Every training session, every achievement, every piece of battle-hardening experience, it all evaporated in the presence of that thing. Mendoza was so terrified she might as well have been a child. The monster just stood there beyond the curtain. Its raw, fleshy face parted into a freakishly wide, yellow-toothed grin. She didn't know how, but on some deep primal level, she was aware that if this thing got its hands on her, something horrific beyond description would happen to her. She was too terrified to even move a muscle in its presence. She remained like that, standing in the shower and sobbing quietly for the next 3 solid hours, until the creature finally disappeared. When her colleagues found her, she'd experienced moderate scalding wounds from the hot water of the shower. It took several hours for Agent Mendoza to compose herself enough to share her story. A couple days later, Tim Ellis, a junior-level filing clerk, was found trapped in a Site-41 supply closet. He'd urinated in his Foundation-issued slacks and was in a state of borderline catatonia. When his superiors asked him why he'd been spending 2 hours in a supply closet on company time, he reported that it was because a monster had appeared outside the door when he was searching for a replacement stapler. Despite never actually opening the door to see what was outside or call for help, Mr. Ellis said that he felt as though he would have had a heart attack if he actually opened that accursed door. He was able to provide a clear description of the monster. He said it was tall and emaciated, with reddish-brown skin that made it seem almost burnt or rotten. While it stood there and waited beyond the supply closet door, it let out the most awful wheezing noise, like an old, rusty iron lung. But the image that Ellis seemed most fixated on was the monster's face, or lack thereof. Just a huge, grinning mouth that covered up its entire head, stocked with an arsenal of massive yellow teeth. Ellis was visibly shivering as he talked about it. 2 incidents are an unpleasant coincidence, but 3 are a bona fide pattern. And it didn't take long for more sightings of this strange new anomaly, dubbed SCP-303 or the Doorman, to pop up across the site. It earned that name by always appearing behind some kind of doorway, or at least a movable divider, in the case of Agent Mendoza's shower curtain. Whenever it appeared outside a doorway, nearby Foundation personnel would report being struck with a sudden paralyzing terror that made engaging with the creature impossible. Attempts to call for help were also often stifled, as the very presence of the doorman causes disruptions to electrical equipment. Whenever the doorman manifests in your proximity, it's safe to say that it'll be commanding your absolute undivided attention. This was a particularly frightening case for the SCP Foundation, because it was one of the few anomalies bringing the fight directly to them. Most sentient anomalous beings would do anything to avoid getting captured by the SCP Foundation and contained in one of their high-security sites, full of experienced researchers and state-of-the-art equipment designed specifically to neutralize their effects. The doorman, however, just seemed to take this as a challenge, turning even the most hardcore personnel on the site into gibbering wrecks with its mere presence. But the doorman was just getting started. Agent Henderson had a frightening encounter in the break room. He was pulling a long shift and just wanted to grab some coffee creamer from the cabinet. However, as he approached the cabinet, he heard the telltale wheezing and that terrible, overwhelming terror set in once more. The doorman was sitting inside the cabinet in a fetal position. He just knew it. Could this thing really appear just anywhere as it pleased, and keep people in or out until it decided to dematerialize and torment somebody else? When the creature finally dematerialized and the cabinet was examined, the coffee creamer was found to be missing, leaving Agent Henderson distraught. This was the first recorded instance of the doorman stealing a physical item, but it would be far from the last. Henderson wondered whether the creature that had just humiliated him was sitting somewhere else now, sipping from a warm cup of joe, with its big, freakish mouth and laughing at him. But a few incidents after this, things would become considerably more serious. The doorman was about to take its first life. Well, it isn't really that simple, if you want to get into the semantics of the thing. When the body of Dr. Barker was found inside the second-floor storage room after a spree of SCP-303 incidents, the question was naturally posed as to whether the doorman had gotten more dangerous and finally directly attacked one of its victims. Not quite. There had only been one way in and out of the storage room, a secured decompression chamber, and the doorman had appeared inside this chamber while Dr. Barker was in the storage room, effectively trapping him inside with the sheer terror it causes in its victims. He was trapped in the room for a grand total of 5 days, at which point he finally died of dehydration, and the doorman demanifested shortly afterward. The staff of Site-41 scaled up their countermeasure efforts, hoping to discover more about and perhaps even trap and contain the infamous doorman. Dr. Burroughs, Researcher Matthews, 4 members of security personnel, and 4 D-Class operatives formed a kind of strike team, ready for quick dispatches whenever the doorman happened to manifest. It wasn't long before the creature appeared in a room on the first floor, but the team quickly intercepted its location, ready and eager to gather more data on the mysterious being that had been terrorizing them all for weeks. Dr. Burroughs ordered one of the D-Classes to open the door and look inside, but the D-Class refused out of fear. The doctor told him that if he didn't open the door, he'd be transferred to SCP-682 duty. The D-Class frantically shook his head and said, "I'd rather take my chances with the reptile than go in there." The doctor was getting frustrated. He told the D-Class that if he didn't open the door immediately, he'd be terminated right there on the spot. The D-Class still refused, saying that he'd take death over what the doorman would do to him if he stepped inside. Without hesitation, Dr. Burroughs ordered one of the security officers to shoot the D-Class then and there. The shot was fired. The D-Class was terminated. Dr. Burroughs then ordered a female D-Class who just witnessed this callous execution to open the door, or the same abrupt death would befall her. She still refused, then began to describe the awful things she believed the doorman would do to her if she went inside. Researcher Matthews was visibly shaken by the description. Dr. Burroughs decided not to terminate this D-Class immediately. He instead wanted to see just how much pressure the doorman's anomalous fear-based resistance mechanisms could take. Another D-Class was given a combat knife, and also given the order to cut the female D-Class with it every time she refused and ordered to go inside. After 2 hours of repeated asking from Dr. Burroughs, the female D-Class dropped dead from blood loss. At no point did she ever attempt to open the door. It seemed that in all the cases for those in the thrall of the doorman's anomalous effects, death is a truly preferable alternative to ever facing it head-on.
It's worth mentioning that these tests were conducted back in the 1970s, before the formation of the Foundation's Ethics Committee, which explains why their methods feel a little needlessly cruel. Since then, the Doorman has fully commandeered the second-floor storage room, the same one where it caused Dr. Barker's death. It only leaves the room to steal more items from around the site. These items have included a cryotube, 3 sets of standard Foundation surgical equipment, 2 D-class research cadavers, 1 gasoline-powered generator, a variety of chemicals from the chemical storage areas, and, of course, poor Agent Henderson's can of powdered coffee creamer. The reason for the Doorman taking an interest in these particular items remains unknown, but we can only assume that nothing good can come of it. And there you have it, folks, the strange, frightening, and eerily inconclusive tale of the Doorman. All we can really say is that we're awfully glad he's fixated on bothering Site-41, because who knows what would happen if he widened his net to the rest of us. Thankfully, we won't need to think about that. Oh, that's odd. Can you hear that? I thought I was imagining it. Though come to think of it, I can't help but feel a little uneasy right now. Do you ever get that feeling that you're being watched? Wait, the door. There's something behind the door. Can you feel it? Can you feel its red flesh and rotten teeth pressing up against it, breathing, waiting? Can you feel it staring at you without eyes, looking deep into your very soul? Well, that's good, but just stay cautious, okay? After all, life has many doors, Ed Boy, and you never know who or what will be waiting for you behind the next one.
The aftershock shuddered through the Foundation. Emergency alarms wailed as injured staff and security helped each other out from underneath rubble that had fallen on them as the building was shaken by the quake. It had only lasted a few short seconds, but still managed to leave a trail of destruction in its wake. While the wounded were bandaged up, anyone and everyone who was still able to started frantically checking the containment of every anomaly on the site. The Foundation could worry about the origin of the quake later. First and foremost, they needed to assess the damage. Luckily, multiple rapid sweeps of the facility revealed that there weren't all that many high-level threat anomalies whose containment had been breached. A few of the safer ones were found cowering under tables or buried under fallen rubble in their quarters. But for the most part, every anomaly was accounted for, and none had been provided with an opportunity to escape and cause further havoc. At least, that's how things seemed at first. It was only when the chaos started to die down and repair efforts were underway that personnel noticed an odd change. Something was missing, but nobody could quite put their finger on exactly what. As a matter of fact, most could pinpoint exactly when they noticed this odd feeling. It had only begun after the emergency alarms had been shut off. There was a sound that everyone working at the Foundation had gotten so used to that they practically stopped hearing it, or at least, they'd stopped noticing it. It was only now that the noise was gone, its absence no longer drowned out by blaring alarms, that staff realized it had always been there. Everyone had just learned to subconsciously tune it out. Crying. The low, soft whimpering that could be heard emanating from SCP-096's containment chamber. It had stopped. The cell within had fallen silent, and once someone at the Foundation made the right connection and investigated, they happened upon a startling discovery. SCP-096 had vanished. Panic immediately engulfed the facility yet again. The Shy Guy could be anywhere, and a search effort to find it would only end in deaths. After all, in order to find something, you have to look at it, and that was a fatal thing to do when SCP-096 was involved. Closer examination showed no trace of the missing creature. There had been no reported incidents of incursions with it anywhere in the world. Every known photograph, video recording, or other visual depiction of SCP-096 was either securely stashed away or destroyed completely by the Foundation. There was no way it could have possibly escaped, and it was seemingly nowhere at all. But still, the question remained, where in the world had the Shy Guy gone to? If it was still even in this world. From SCP-096's perspective, one moment all had been normal. The next, it was lost somewhere strange, unfamiliar, and above all unsettling, even to the Shy Guy. Before the sudden quake had hit, it had spent the day the same way it usually occupied its time, alternating between aimlessly pacing the far wall of its containment chamber and sitting in a fetal position in the corner, sobbing all the while. But then the room had started shaking, and in the blink of a deeply sunken eye, the Shy Guy found itself, well, it had no idea where. Around it was a large carpeted room, open and sparse, with little occupying all the space. The wallpaper was a nauseating, sickly shade of yellow, made all the more garish by the rows of fluorescent lighting from the ceiling above. The entire place seemed to resemble an office space, although seemingly one that was in a total state of disuse. There was no furniture, not even one solitary inanimate object to make the place seem at least the tiniest bit closer to normal. Little was SCP-096 aware it had somehow been transported to a strange and terrible place, the Backrooms. Unless someone remains wary and ever vigilant, they can unknowingly slip their way out of reality. It can happen anywhere. All that a person needs to do is be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they will no-clip into the Backrooms. All around SCP-096 was the stench of old, wet carpet, and a labyrinth of uninhabited rooms with the same drab yellow walls, the endless buzz of the fluorescent lights stretching out for who knows how many square miles of empty rooms. In short, the Shy Guy was trapped in a purgatory-like nightmare. However, there was at least one small mercy for SCP-096 as it wandered around its new surroundings. There was nobody else around, no other signs of life. No SCP Foundation, no ordinary human beings, no one who could see it. Here in the solitary confinement of the Backrooms, SCP-096 could not be perceived. And yet this brought the self-conscious creature very little in the way of comfort. Despite being completely alone, there was an awful lingering feeling that hung in the air like the smell of the old carpet underfoot. SCP-096 still felt like it was being watched. And yet, if someone or something really was watching, it wasn't triggering the Shy Guy's usual rage state. As it lurked through the various rooms and corridors, the creature kept expecting to find someone, to look them in the eye directly and get the same inescapable urge to race towards its observer and kill them. But it never came, because there was nobody else around, at least for a little while. Adam Jenkins had been out riding his bike when it happened. Pushing one pedal around, then the other, he gradually climbed higher up the slope of a hill. His house was down at the bottom of the other side, and Adam knew once he reached the peak, he could slip nice and easily down the rest of the way. As long as he was careful not to let the extra momentum carry his bike too far and too fast, he just had to keep in control and gently compress the brake if he needed to. He made the same journey every day. Nothing could go wrong. Sure enough, Adam reached the top of the hill and allowed the bike to slowly tip ever so slightly over the other side. Gravity started to do the rest, the wheels starting to spin rapidly, the pedals pistoning his legs as he plummeted downwards. It was one of the few childlike joys left in Adam's life, those few brief seconds of the day where he got to speed down the hill back home with reckless abandon. He was blissfully unaware that he wouldn't have enough time to miss how much he enjoyed it. Without warning, a car came speeding out from around a corner on the way down the hill. It was dark, and the driver had carelessly decided to leave their headlights off. So when Adam saw the vehicle, he only had a split second to react. He was still going too fast. So if he applied the brakes now, his front wheel would stop too suddenly and send him flying forward over the handlebars. Instead, seconds before colliding with the car's hood, Adam wrenched his bike's handlebars and swerved around the car. But the added speed of going downhill caused the entire bike to topple as it turned so violently, launching Adam off and sending him hurtling towards a nearby wall. Adam could tell in the split second after coming off his bike that he was about to collide with the wall. His brain and body anticipated the impact, bracing him for the painful crash, but it never came. Instead of hitting the wall, Adam passed through it. That may well have spared him a devastating injury, but now a whole new problem now faced him. Just like no clipping through a virtual environment in a video game, Adam had passed directly out of reality, right into the Backrooms. The first few hours were the worst, shouting as loud as he could for someone, anyone, to come and find him. Each yell rapidly growing more and more frantic as Adam rushed around his haunting new surroundings. The whole place was unsettling just to be in. It gave off a hostile, unwelcoming energy that was impossible to ignore. It was only after an hour of trying to find a way out that Adam realized he was well and truly lost. He'd strayed too far away from his original point of entry. and just as he had the idea of trying to make his way back to the world from the same place he came in, it was already too late. The backrooms, at least on this first level, all looked the same. No two rooms were distinct enough for him to figure out if this was somewhere he'd been before, or an entirely new area. It didn't take long for an overwhelming sense of hopelessness to set in. Adam had quickly given up calling for help. There was no sign of anyone around that would be able to help him, until the shuffling of footsteps came from nearby. It was such a noticeable break in the dull, unsettling quiet of the backrooms that it made Adam's ears prick up. The yellow-hued maze had been so void of life since he had arrived, so unnaturally empty, that he wasn't entirely sure he had made the sound himself by his jacket brushing up against the wall. But no, there was definitely something here with him. He could hear it wandering nearby, and it had certainly heard him too. Calling out yet again with more caution in his tone, Adam Jenkins turned the next corner, met with yet another dingy yellow corridor. Although, unlike the others, this one had a key difference. SCP-096 stood right in the middle of it. The split second that Adam's eyes fell over the shy guy, it was already too late. He barely had time to process the sight of the creature, its tall, humanoid shape, wiry, thin, and pale skin, jaw hanging unnaturally wide. In fact, SCP-096 dashed towards Adam so quickly that he couldn't even finish his startled scream. Meanwhile, back at the SCP Foundation, efforts were still underway to retrieve the shy guy. Researchers were baffled that there was not a single trace anywhere on the globe of SCP-096's presence. They had quickly rolled out their usual method for recalling the creature to containment. Requisitioning one of D-Class personnel, this individual was instructed to stand in SCP-096's cell and then was given a photograph of the monster to look at. Knowing that the shy guy would track down anyone that saw its face, even as a single tiny pixel in a picture, the Foundation expected the creature to simply reappear in its containment chamber to kill the D-Class they had used as bait. But nothing happened. The D-Class was able to look at the photo of SCP-096 and survive. It was almost as if the creature's link to reality was weakened. Wherever it was, it might still be aware someone had looked at it, but the shy guy was somehow being blocked from traveling to its most recent observer. Having drawn a blank on trying to determine SCP-096's whereabouts, the Foundation eventually turned to SCP-343 for his input. Naturally, the powerful reality bender was reluctant as ever to get involved. The Foundation insisted, knowing that SCP-343's omniscience meant he would already be aware of where they could find the missing shy guy. He refused multiple times, admitting he did have the answer they were looking for, but not wishing to divulge that information.
Fine.
SCP-343 sighed, coming to a compromise.
I can't tell you exactly where 096 is, but when I tell you where to look for answers, you'll know. Async.
The researchers were stunned into silence. Nobody in the Foundation had heard that name used in a long time, but SCP-343 was right. They knew exactly what it meant. Back in the 1980s, Async was another shadowy organization that had been investigating the existence of a liminal space connected to reality, a place they had called the Backrooms. Gathering up a mobile task force, the SCP Foundation dispatched its agents to a site that had long since been abandoned. They'd kept a watchful eye over the disused lab, keeping the public away, making sure nobody stumbled in by accident and got trapped. As the MTF commander gave the word, the outdated 80s technology was fired up, and Async's great achievement was reactivated. They had constructed a portal into the Backrooms. Moving information, the MTF operatives filed into the empty yellow space, unsure if they'd find SCP-096 alive, or if it would even want to come back. Meanwhile, in the Backrooms Level 0, only the shy guy remained, having completely annihilated poor, unfortunate Adam. He was enjoying the solitude once again, knowing that now nobody was here to see him, until one wrong step changed everything. He no-clipped from Level 0 to Level 1, where he would have a lot more company.
On March 15, 2011, Martin Sims was wandering down the streets of Carson, California. His clothes were ragged, he was filthy, and gibbering like a madman with a full beard and long, unkempt hair. His body was covered in scars, but he showed no signs of malnutrition. What made Martin's sudden appearance so remarkable? He'd been missing for 3 years. When he was interviewed by police, they asked him where he'd been all this time. They couldn't believe his answer. He'd been trapped in an IKEA since 2008, but this was no ordinary IKEA. This was a dangerous anomaly that would come to be known as SCP-3008. Martin's strange answers in his interview were laughed off by his interviewing officers, who assumed he was either crazy or under the influence of something, but they caught the attention of an SCP Foundation field agent embedded in the precinct. The report was passed up the chain to a local site director who approved a detachment of Foundation field operatives to look into Martin's case. While he was reluctant to lead the Foundation agents back to the offending IKEA, the Foundation can be extremely persuasive. His screams of, "Please, I'm begging you, don't take me back, don't make me go back," were noted but ultimately disregarded. When the SCP Foundation had triangulated the position of SCP-3008, which was indeed an active IKEA, the entire retail zone was closed and barricaded under the pretense of a severe black mold infestation. Armed Foundation personnel also arrived on the site shortly after, based on Martin's vague statements that there were creatures of some kind inside. Due to his deteriorating mental health, Martin was unable to provide a great deal of lucid information on the specific traits of SCP-3008. But one phrase he kept repeating was "bigger on the inside." Once researchers were satisfied that Martin had delivered all the pertinent information he was able to, he was administered Foundation amnestics to erase his memory of the last 3 years and return to his family. A cover story was formulated. Martin had been kidnapped and abused for 3 years by a mentally unbalanced stalker in downtown Carson. He'd been able to escape as said stalker took his own life out of guilt, a suicide that the Foundation expertly fabricated to make their cover story airtight. With the loose end of Martin Sims taken care of, the true observation of SCP-3008 could begin. A base set around the perimeter of the mysterious IKEA kept a 24-hour watch on the building, covering all potential entrances and exits. No exploratory missions had yet been approved by the Foundation Ethics Committee, so they first wanted to perform a week of external observation to see if any of the store's anomalous properties extended beyond the confines of the building. After a week of nothing, it appeared they did not. A local site director approved of the use of 20 disposable Class D personnel to explore the interior of SCP-3008. The D-Class operatives would be split into 4 squads of 5 men, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta Squad. Each would be assigned a different quadrant of the store and would deliver information back to the control team on site via a live audio and video link. 3 of the 4 teams upon entering the store reported nothing out of the ordinary. Neither the audio or video they were sending back indicated anything different from a standard IKEA store, from the flat-pack wardrobes to the Swedish meatballs. Team Delta, however, suddenly began experiencing a scrambled audio and video connection. Shortly after, communication with Team Delta dropped off entirely. They disappeared somewhere inside the store and haven't been seen since, with one notable exception. After the disappearance and the extraction of teams, Foundation researchers classified SCP-3008 as Euclid because its anomalous properties were at least confined to the interior of the store, and even then seemingly not the entire interior. The anomalous area within SCP-3008 became known as SCP-3008-1, and containment appeared to be 100% secure. There was no telling how many people had already gone missing in the store over the years, but the disappearances must be stopped. The Foundation maintained constant surveillance around the perimeter of SCP-3008, but it appeared they could prevent any further incidents by simply preventing other civilians from accessing the IKEA store. Martin's ravings about monsters were assumed to just be the product of delirium, until a surviving member of Delta Team suddenly reappeared. The date was November 3rd, 2011. It was a cold night, a few hours after what would have been closing time if the store were still active, and 7 months after the extraction teams had disappeared somewhere in the confines of SCP-3008. There had been no anomalous activity outside the store since the perimeter was first secured, and the Foundation researchers hadn't expected that to change until the last surviving member of Delta Team came barging out of the store's entrance. Startled field operatives were amazed to see him again, but they were even more amazed to see what was following him out of the store, repeating the same phrase, "The store is now closed, please exit the building." Despite the fact that the entity chasing the Delta Team survivor was wearing the yellow shirt and blue pants of an IKEA store employee, the being definitely was not human. It was around 7 feet tall with no visible face. The entity had grossly extended limbs, with each arm being around 5 or 6 feet long and ending in a huge oversized hand. The whole process was so sudden that the field agents present at the perimeter weren't able to save the Delta Team survivor, as the entity reached forward with his freakishly long arms, grabbed him and twisted his head off like a child with a doll. The field operatives present drew their weapons and peppered the entity with bullets. It would later be classified as SCP-3008-2. The being appeared to collapse and die from the physical trauma, at which point it and the body of the former Delta Team survivor were taken for an autopsy by Foundation researchers. There were no biological abnormalities of the body of the Delta Team survivor, so it did not appear that the anomalous properties of SCP-3008-1 had any effect on the physiology of its occupants. He was not malnourished despite being missing for months, and the contents of his stomach looked to be half-digested food consistent with the menu of a typical IKEA store restaurant. SCP-3008-2, on the other hand, raised a number of perplexing biological questions. The autopsy revealed that the creature's clothes were actually part of its body, like an additional layer of skin. The creature lacked blood or any kind of vascular system. Even stranger, the entity didn't appear to have bones or internal organs, not even a brain or nervous system. It was a being made entirely of skin all the way to its core. How it was able to move, or even live for that matter, remains a mystery. Though when you work for the SCP Foundation, you learn to accept that some things will always remain unexplained. One thing was certain though, Martin Sims was right about his monsters. After the incident with Delta Team, the Foundation deemed that sending manned explorations into the heart of SCP-3008 was too much of a liability and planned a series of drone-based reconnaissance missions into the anomaly. The first of these drones experienced connection issues and failed when attempting to venture into the IKEA's anomalous zone. However, after a lengthy period of trial and error, the Foundation was able to establish a more secure connection with its drones, even when deep into the SCP-3008-1 anomalous zone. It was only then that some of the most extraordinary discoveries were made. SCP-3008-1 seemed to break the laws of spatial reality, as the area of the IKEA's interior was at least an order of magnitude larger than its exterior. Just as Martin Sims had said, it was bigger on the inside, but just how much bigger? The Foundation has yet to find evidence of any physical terminators within the store that might indicate SCP-3008-1 has an endpoint, while an area of at least 10 kilometers squared has been uncovered in SCP-3008-1. It could, in theory, be infinite. Laser rangefinder tests, which are normally very reliable, have only given inconclusive results. Interestingly, the anomalous area doesn't have any clear visual differences from the rest of the IKEA store, except that it extends forever. An individual trapped within the confines of SCP-3008-1 wouldn't even realize they've entered an anomalous zone until they tried to locate an exit and leave, at which point they'd find they were already hopelessly lost. The geography of SCP-3008-1 does at least appear to be consistent, so people trapped within are theoretically able to retrace their steps and escape if they haven't already ventured too deep. According to data collected during the drone reconnaissance missions, SCP-3008-2, of which there appear to be a vast population, would wander the stores aimlessly during the day. They are unresponsive to the drone's presence and did not appear to be aggressive. While the physical descriptions of these creatures could vary slightly, they all follow the same overall trend. Clothes consistent with an IKEA uniform, no face, either seemingly too tall or too short, and limbs that are grossly out of proportion with their bodies. As the Foundation began sending drones deeper into SCP-3008-1, they found another incredible discovery. There was an unknown population of humans trapped inside IKEA's anomalous zone, and these people had used the IKEA furniture around them to create entire settlements and towns within the store. There were several of these towns, all of which seemed to cohabitate peacefully. Even Foundation personnel found this development in their research to be truly extraordinary. Since SCP-3008 was first identified, there have been only 14 civilian escapes. Some had been trapped inside for months, others had been in there for years, some far longer than Martin's 3-year stint. While every one of these escapees has eventually been released back to their home, after a liberal application of amnestics and a proper cover story has been devised, the Foundation interviewed each of them extensively first. According to each of these escapees, the people trapped inside the IKEA have built an entirely new society across the various settlements. Contrary to the Lord of the Flies expectations of a group of people isolated and afraid, there's immense cooperation between the trapped civilians. The food in the several IKEA restaurants in SCP-3008-1 mysteriously replenishes while nobody's there, so there's no threat of starving, and the automatic turning on and off of the lights forms as a rudimentary kind of day and night cycle. Nighttime, however, is when things get dangerous, as the SCP-3008-2 entities, which are known to the people inside as the staff, become extremely hostile after dark. Aggressive hordes of the staff swarm the settlements at night, repeating, "This door is now closed, please exit the building." The civilians inside are usually able to repel these attacks with minimal casualties, but the constant war of attrition slowly wears down those inside. The bodies of the creatures also need to be removed from the area after each attack, as the presence of corpses or even parts of corpses has been known to heighten the ferocity of the next night's attack. During the day, the staff return to a docile and unresponsive state, though they'll still defend themselves violently if anyone dares to attack. Over the course of the interviews with the 14 escapees, Foundation researchers were able to answer another of their key questions. How had so many people gone missing in the store for so long without being noticed? But the answer they received only raised many more unsettling queries. According to the escapees, there were people inside the settlements that, despite being otherwise of entirely sound mind and standard intelligence, seemed to lack very common knowledge that even a child should know. For example, some of them weren't aware of the International Space Station orbiting the Earth, or stranger still, the existence of the Statue of Liberty. This led the researchers to a frightening conclusion. SCP-3008-1 may not only be a nexus point of multiple IKEA stores in our dimension, it could be connected to IKEAs in every dimension where IKEAs exist. While it only abducts a handful of people from each store over an extended period of time, it suddenly becomes clear how this SCP was able to trap so many people without detection over such a long period of time, which in turn led to an even more terrifying revelation. The SCP Foundation may not have SCP-3008-1 as contained as they thought. It might even be tucked away in an IKEA store somewhere near you, just waiting for you to visit. After all, there's always room for one more.
Your boss's office, his name etched on the frosted glass window in the door, sitting at the end of a long hallway. He called you in, and you don't know if you'll be leaving with your job. A grimy public bathroom filled with graffiti, spiders, cracked toilet seats, and a sinister shadow in the very last stall. A surgical theater where masked doctors wait with gleaming scalpels, forceps, and bone saws, preparing for an operation that you don't know if you'll wake up from. All of these have one thing in common. They're rooms that inspire dread. But after this video, you'll look back on all of them like you would your cozy childhood bedroom. A wise man once said, life has many doors. What he didn't say is that sometimes opening the wrong door can be a way of bringing that life to an untimely end, or worse. Especially when you're dealing with the kind of horrifying anomalies secured and contained by the SCP Foundation. You may think it's what's lurking inside the room that might be your biggest threat, but that's a potentially lethal assumption. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is the room itself. And that's what we're here to talk about today. 7 of the most terrifying rooms on the Foundation's database, none of which have ever been featured on this channel before. So reach out, grab the handle, and open the door. Welcome to the SCP Foundation's most terrifying rooms. All you can do is hope that, by the end, you'll actually be able to leave. We'll begin with an old classic from Series 1, SCP-002, a maleficent meatball known as the living room. There's a decent chance you're sitting in your living room right now while you watch this video, so you may be thinking, what's so wrong about that? But this really is a living room, and it's always on the lookout for some tasteful new furniture. From the outside, SCP-002 appears to be a huge, tumorous blob made out of living flesh. Sure, that may seem off-putting, but don't be so superficial. The inside of 002 is a different story. It may appear like your standard low-rent apartment from within, but this place has a lot of personality. There's a single window, despite there being no opening for a window from the outside. In addition to all the standard furniture, chairs, tables, a TV stand, it's actually developed a number of other wonderful amenities since being contained by the Foundation, including 2 lamps, a throw rug, a television, a radio, a beanbag chair, 3 books in an unknown language, 4 children's toys, and a small potted plant. The first thing you might notice about the room is the funny smell. Then you might take a closer look at all that lovely furniture. That's when you'll realize that every single piece of furniture in there is made out of human tissue. Wood is polished and varnished bone. Fabrics are woven from human hair. Leather is made from tanned human skin. This is what happens to anyone who enters SCP-002. And sadly, if you've gotten close enough to see this, it's already too late. We hope you enjoy the rest of your existence as a brand new armchair. But maybe you don't want to get turned into furniture inside a living room within a giant tumor. Maybe you've got more specific needs. You like puzzles, exercises, and most of all, solitude. You like to test your mental and physical fortitude without worrying about the distractions caused by having to deal with other human beings. If that sounds like you, then let's get your feet wet and tell you about a wonderful piece of prime real estate you can find under the sea, SCP-057. This underwater chamber is almost impossible to get to without a James Cameron-style mini-submarine, but believe us, it's worth the effort. If you manage to access SCP-057 and enter its submerged chamber, then you're going to be treated to the best last challenge of your life. The door will close behind you, permanently, ensuring that wonderful privacy you so covet. Then the walls. These impenetrable monoliths of slate-covered stone will begin to move. Like a kind of high-stakes game show, you'll need to keep moving, avoiding the ever-shifting walls as the environment around you becomes more and more disorienting. There is no escape, only survival, and survival is only temporary. When your body fails you, or your mind snaps under the weight of sustained mortal terror, that's when those walls will close in. The monoliths of SCP-057 will get closer and closer and closer, until your body is crushed between them, killing you with a torturously slow squeeze where nothing and nobody will ever hear your final choked screams. But it's all worth it for that glorious ocean view. Oh, look at all those adorable little fishies. But hey, maybe sea punk isn't your favorite aesthetic. Maybe you're the more industrial type. You couldn't feel more at home than among a complex network of anomalous pipes. We'll admit that's eerily specific, but it isn't half as eerie as SCP-015. If you ever find yourself opening the door to the main room of a certain undisclosed warehouse, you'll feel like you've walked into an early 2000s screensaver with a decidedly gritty edge. An impossibly huge and intricate mass of pipes, vents, boilers, and other various plumbing apparatus that just keeps growing, seemingly becoming more strange and anomalous as it does so. These pipes have been made out of bone, wood, steel, pressed ash, human flesh, glass, and granite. There aren't any pipes made out of traditional pipe-making materials like lead, copper, ceramics, or PVC. And if you think what the pipes are made of is weird, the materials that travel through them are even freakier. These include oil, mercury, rats, a species of insect not yet identified, ground glass, seawater, entrails, and molten iron. And this is important to remember, because if you appear hostile to SCP-015 or enter the room carrying tools, the pipes will begin to burst and spray you with their contents in self-defense, resulting in one of the few times in human history where you'd be incredibly lucky to only be sprayed with rats or human entrails. Much like SCP-173, the sculpture, it's important to keep this room under strict observation. It's when the pipes are left unoccupied that they start expanding and trying to grow downwards in the hopes of mixing with the sewer system below. If ever that happens, then the pipes may end up coming to a room near you. And considering that people have also reported screaming coming from inside the pipes, what comes out of them may not even be as frightening as what could be going in. But maybe you don't want a warehouse. Perhaps you just want to rent a small, cozy room in a one-story building over in Weehawken, New Jersey. Problem is, if you try to do this, you might end up lodging in SCP-5256, a room that defies reality in a number of freaky ways thanks to its prior occupant, a highly unstable reality warper. The reality filters get stronger the further you go into the room, with the terminus being the room's far corner, which presents as an empty void that's impossible to even see. A damaged bloody hammer is lodged into the far wall. Metal fragments covered in human blood float near the entrance, half-eaten bugs all over the floor. There's a crucifix on the wall along with medical-grade anesthetics with trace amounts of neural tissue inside. All evidence points to the reality warper having been the victim of atrocious and inhumane acts, perhaps as a way to cure it of its anomalous affliction. And to add to the creep factor, many believe its body is still in there, lurking in the unseeable corner. How do we know? Because despite the corner of the room being unseeable, people have still performed simple tactile tests by sticking their hand into the space. One D-Class reported it feeling like leathery flesh with occasional scraps of fabric, and sharp needle-like objects occasionally sticking out of its skin. But for rent this cheap, who can really complain about a body or two? But that's enough about things that are just creepy. Let's get to dangerous instead. A room that won't just freak you out with some eerie anomalous sights. If you get unlucky, it'll give you a horrifying death. After all, who doesn't like a little excitement? Step into SCP-4595, a small room in a woodshed behind an abandoned house near Jasper, Indiana. You'll be taken in by its rustic charm at first. It's a quiet, peaceful setting where you're alone with your thoughts. When the room was first found, it contained a small, blood-stained shovel and a skeleton of an adolescent male. But don't let that put you off. Don't let the charcoal marking of the word witch written on the exterior door bother you either. It all just adds to the character of the room. Oh, there is one thing we should probably mention. There is an entity known as SCP-4595-A that lives a meter beneath the room. She's a witch-like creature, rotted and covered in wounds on her torso and face. Her mere presence will instill a sense of paranoia and dread into you, getting worse and worse the longer you're in there. But stay quiet about it. If at any point you disturb SCP-4595, all the empty spaces in your chest cavity as well as your lungs, airways, stomach, and intestine will suddenly fill with live desert locusts, causing you to experience a horrible death. So be a considerate upstairs neighbor, or else. So remember when we said earlier that it's not always what's inside the room that can cause you harm? Sometimes it's the thing right on the other side of the door. Look at the nearest closed door. Really focus on it. Tell us, how can you be so sure there's not something on the other side? Can you hear its heavy, wheezing breaths? It's not a home invader. It's something even worse. SCP-303. And it can make any room, anywhere, an absolute nightmare for you. Keep an eye on that door while we explain. SCP-303 is a tall, emaciated creature with dark skin and no face. Just a giant mouth twisted into a fixed grimace of pain with unnaturally long teeth. Nobody has ever seen its full body, but everyone afflicted with its anomalous effects somehow has an innate knowledge of exactly what they're dealing with. The amount of time that 303 spends behind the door seems to be random, but whenever it appears, people will be afflicted with such a level of raw, paralytic terror that they physically cannot bear to open the door while it's still there. This is one thing if it's hiding inside a broom closet, but if you're trapped in a room with only one exit, and 303 manifests behind it, you are in real trouble. As the number of people who have died of dehydration and starvation in totally normal rooms while boxed in by 303 have found out, when you're dealing with this monster, any room can be a nightmare. But while 303 is no doubt scary, it's not quite as mind-melting as SCP-970, the final anomalous room on this list. Much like 303, it involves doors, and rather than being fixed to a single location, it can appear in theoretically any room. Known as the recursive room, stepping through this door will lead to a copy of the room you were just inside. A little trippy, but not exactly pure nightmare fuel. But much like how a photocopier will slowly create distortions if the same image is copied repeatedly, the more rooms in the recursive room sequence that one cycles through, the more distorted each one gets. Eventually, the rooms will begin to display visuals straight out of your worst nightmares. Foundation researchers who sent a drone through a 6-hour sequence of recursive rooms ended up being discharged to undergo psychiatric treatment after seeing their own mutilated corpses in the rooms. A cruel trick? Or a deadly phenomenon of things to come in a darker possible future?
Either way, these unfortunate researchers couldn't get their experience in the recursive room out of their heads, but we're sure you'll have a more pleasant time. There you have it, folks. Some of the most terrifying rooms that the SCP Foundation is aware of. Let us know which one was your favorite down in the comments. And of course, be careful. If these are the ones the Foundation has in containment, imagine the ones that are still out there, waiting to be discovered. For all you know, it could only be one door away.
Hello everyone. If you're a fan of SCP Explained, you'll know that we regularly post interesting questions in our community tab, asking for responses from you, our dear fans. These have ranged from questions about specific anomalies like SCP-096, or your suggestions on how we should actually kill SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile. We've even asked you which anomalous powers you'd want to have and posed your questions directly to SCP-343, also known as God, and of course, the terrifying and infamous Scarlet King. But in our latest community question, asking you about hypothetical crossovers between the SCP Foundation and the weird wild multiverse of all fiction, you truly outdid yourself, with thousands upon thousands of responses. And we thought rather than just making one video selecting our favorites, we'd turn each of our favorites into whole videos. And how are we going to do that? That's where this wonderful state-of-the-art gizmo comes into play. You may remember the Anomatron 6000, our incredibly advanced artificial intelligence-driven supercomputer designed specifically to run simulations for the SCP Foundation. We fed this computer data from countless SCP Foundation experiments and cross-tests, and all the data from your suggestions. This will allow the fine folks at the SCP Foundation to explore any anomalous hypothetical without risking the lives of staff members or civilians. This brings us to our first simulation, suggested in a huge number of comments. Could SCP-682 be contained within the Backrooms? For those not in the know, the Backrooms is an internet urban legend that spiraled into a full-blown phenomenon. It's built on the premise that if you're not careful and enter certain specific circumstances, you can no-clip out of our reality and enter a terrifying multi-level alternate reality, where you're stalked by a variety of bizarre and frightening creatures. This could be a complete nightmare for your average person, but how would it play out if SCP-682, the endlessly angry, hard-to-destroy reptile, found its way inside? Also, for another Backrooms-related surprise, stick around until the end of the video. In the meantime though, let's boot up the Anomatron and test this new scenario. The worst had happened again. SCP-682 had busted out of containment during a cross-test and started making a beeline for the nearest populated area. Several helicopters containing heavily armed MTF New 7 Hammerdown members were in hot pursuit, attempting to slow the vicious reptile down with targeted sniper fire at its legs. But it seems that these efforts were all for naught. SCP-682 had already reached the defunct industrial district on the edge of a nearby city, and if the beast managed to actually reach a populated area, all hell would break loose. That's when they pulled out the heavy weaponry. Miniguns mounted to the helicopters unleashed a rain of hellfire down onto SCP-682. However, 682 managed to dodge most of the bullets and simply tank the rest. Command authorized the use of heavy ordnance, the helicopter's missile launchers. They'd pick up the pieces afterwards, once SCP-682 was back in containment. However, the reptile had plans of its own. It charged into a nearby abandoned chemical plant to avoid the gunfire from above. This was exactly what Hammerdown wanted. The helicopters circled around the chemical plant and unleashed a barrage of powerful incendiary missiles, blowing the plant to Kingdom Come, in hopes of dragging an incapacitated 682 out of the rubble afterwards. But when the smoke had cleared and only the rubble was left, 682 was nowhere to be seen. Even for the hardcore operatives of Hammerdown, this caused an anxiety spike. Had it tunneled into the ground? Had it adapted to the attack by turning invisible or getting tiny to escape? It'd done all these things before, or after all the deranged attempts at putting SCP-682 in the ground, had some light firebombing killed the monster? Whatever the case, they need to search, in case SCP-682 popped up somewhere else and started causing havoc. If it was still alive, which it probably was, they couldn't rest on their laurels until they'd found it again. Meanwhile, SCP-682 woke up. It felt groggy and irritated. its body resting against an unpleasant, soggy carpet. It licked the carpet. The moisture had the distinct flavor of human spinal fluid, which 682 had tasted many times before. The sickly yellow walls and incessant buzzing from the fluorescent lights up above were nauseating, and it gave 682 a nagging headache. This only made 682's default emotion, blistering rage and hatred, even worse. It began walking around exploring this strange, spatial, anomalous environment. Was this more of that frustrating Foundation trickery? Another one of those puerile cross tests? The last thing 682 remembered was running at one of the walls in the chemical plant, a wall that, in hindsight, seemed darker than all the others. But rather than shattering through the brickwork, it was here now, in this strange, tacky lobby that never seemed to end. It was like a kaleidoscope of empty 1990s office kitsch. Endless, worthless yellow walls arranged like some labyrinthian, nonsensical maze leading nowhere and devoid of all life as SCP-682 wandered through it. And of course, SCP-682 found it disgusting. It was only on level 0, and already 682 hated the Backrooms just as much as it hated our dimension. Someone or something had to pay for the crime of inconveniencing it this way, and it would happily turn this whole dimension inside out just to find some beings to kill inside it. Yes, that would be great fun. SCP-682 began its frantic search for an exit, evolving an innate sonar ability and picking up speeds that would be impossible for human beings. This is the part where most people would go mad or die from hunger or thirst. SCP-682, not so much. It could keep searching and searching and searching until the stars burned out in the sky. It would find its prey, somehow, and when it did, it would put them through hell. And as it turned out, this new universe rewarded 682's dog's stubbornness, because when it passed through a seemingly random hallway after hours of searching, it was in a different place entirely. This place looked like some huge abandoned warehouse complex with water shining off the ground. If 682 had more advanced knowledge of the Backrooms, it would have known this was level 1. But the only number SCP-682 cared about was body count, and in that regard it would find level 1 to be a vast improvement. 2 groups of humans had established bases in this level of the Backrooms. The Major Explorer Group, a faction of professional Backrooms travelers who maintained their base alpha on this level, and the Backrooms Non-Aligned Trade Group, a commercial group whose primary base is an economic hub on this very level, a fortified city-like area with a population of 412, which would, a few hours after 682's appearance, be a population of 0. But before all of that, it felt like grabbing a bite at the diner. Tom's Diner is a refuge for many people trapped in the Backrooms, a casual eatery nestled into the cold warehouse environment of level 1, where people could get a warm meal from Tom, a former cook who's been trapped in the backroom for years. SCP-682 was eager to be part of this grand tradition, but the hard-to-destroy reptile decided to buck the trend a little by just devouring Tom himself. From there, it decided to launch its rage-fueled offensive against the various humanoid inhabitants of the level. Both the Major Explorer Group Base Alpha and the Backrooms Non-Aligned Trade Group Trade Keep were heavily fortified against the kind of entities these folks had gotten used to facing in the Backrooms, but they were completely unprepared for a creature of SCP-682's sheer power, intelligence, endurance, and ferocity. The SCP Foundation had been studying the creature for decades, with far more resources than either of these 2 Backrooms-bound groups, and they still had a hard time keeping the beast consistently contained. Sadly for the great bastion of human hope in the Backrooms, SCP-682 swept through both outposts in a matter of hours, killing everyone there without an ounce of remorse. The only person there it took its time with was the final human being left in the decimated remains of the Major Explorers Group Base Alpha. It grabbed the man by the throat and squeezed, asking with its guttural, growling voice,
Were you and your dead brethren allied with the SCP Foundation?
Despite his fear, the Explorer told 682 that he had never heard of the SCP Foundation, nor did he know what kind of entity 682 was.
Then what is this place? Tell me, and I might give you a quick death.
The Explorer gave as good a response as he could. 682 was trapped in the Backrooms, a multi-leveled interdimensional nightmare filled with dangerous creatures. That made 682 curious. Dangerous creatures? That could make an interesting challenge. 682 asked the explorer how it could access these other levels and find these creatures, and the explorer explained that through exploring these levels enough, anyone could no-clip into the next one. It really was that simple. With that, 682 knew all it needed to know and carelessly murdered the final human being of level 1. It had killed so many humans over its long and twisted life, it was no different from breathing air now. An utterly perfunctory action. It was eager to discover these other creatures on the lower levels and teach them a new level of fear they'd never experienced. 682 stormed the halls until it achieved the next successful no-clip into level 2, which manifested as a series of old dilapidated maintenance tunnels that seemed to stretch on for millions of miles. Wonderful. There were humans here too, apparently, but who cared about them? This was the first level to feature a smorgasbord of entities ripe for the killing. It sped through the tunnels, teeth and fangs born, eager to deal death with gleeful abandon. The first entities it encountered in the expansive tunnels of level 2 were a collection of beings known as crawlers, insect-like creatures infected with an extremely aggressive fungal growth. Just getting close to them could present an active risk to humans, not so much for a creature that could easily regenerate after being tossed into the sun. As the creatures tried to lunge, SCP-682 simply crushed and devoured them with little effort. They tasted a little stale on account of the fungus, but the chewiness was pleasing. Hopefully there would be more challenging foes down in the tunnel than these mere insects, SCP-682 thought to itself, while journeying deeper into the endless network of tunnels. Soon enough, SCP-682 ventured into a section of the tunnel engulfed in total darkness. Its eyes quickly adjusted, developing immaculate night vision. That's when it spotted another creature sharing this little slice of darkness with it. A pair of floating, glowing eyes and almost cartoonish teeth, grinning like some maniacal Looney Tune. This is an entity known as a Smiler, and they're a terrifying threat to any humans venturing through the Backrooms. SCP-682 wasn't impressed. It began a perfect adaptation for the situation. Its body began to glow, emitting incredible levels of both heat and light, carving through the darkness of the tunnel and causing the Smiler to emit a terrible, piercing shriek. The sheer heat of this new ability melted sections of the level 2 tunnels around SCP-682. When the light finally dimmed down to slightly more reasonable levels, where the Smiler once stood was instead a fizzling black scorch mark. Another creature had painfully bitten the dust, and SCP-682 was starting to have some fun. It took off further down into the tunnels, looking forward to finding its next victim. Sadly for SCP-682, it wouldn't get to kill the next set of victims. A group of 4 child facelings, spooky, faceless little girls who like to cut apart their typical human victims with small objects, were waiting a little further down the pipe. However, when they felt SCP-682 approaching, they almost sensed the power and cruelty of the beast coming towards them. Even being little monsters themselves, game recognized game, and they knew that they needed to get the hell out of there before the monster arrived. They climbed between the pipes on the tunnel walls and skittered off into hiding places deep in the dark. Lucky for them, SCP-682 passed them and just kept going. What would be the point in wasting time on these little morsels when there were apparently so many other creatures to massacre down here? Next, SCP-682 came across a truly pathetic creature, something that the mighty reptile honestly felt a little embarrassed even interacting with. It was a creature known as a clump, a strange bundle of living limbs that will move at great speeds and attack its usually human targets. It tried to do the same to SCP-682, maniacally flailing its many twisted limbs. 682 killed it in a single stomp and moved on, feeling its own psychological equivalent of pity, but not that much of it. Not long after mercy killing the clump, SCP-682 came face to face with a series of hounds, mutant humanoids who travel on all fours, behaving in a wolf-like fashion. This would, of course, be the stuff of nightmares for your average human being, but would far more likely put a being like the hard-to-destroy reptile to sleep with sheer boredom.
Humans acting like dogs. That makes them even more worthless,
the creature thought, as it charged forwards and began tearing the group of hounds to shreds. Minutes later, it was splitting off into an adjoining tunnel, searching for more easy entertainment. But the deeper SCP-682 made its way into the bowels of Level 2, the more it approached a truly horrifying realization. The creatures it was slaughtering here were even more boring than the ones the SCP Foundation ceaselessly threw at it back on its native reality, or at least the reality where they'd contained it. Back in that world, it had faced giant flaming demigods with swords hotter than the sun. It had faced some pale, shrieking monstrosity that didn't seem to die no matter what the reptile threw at it. There was the dark, gooey old man, the immortal warrior from the Black Coffin, and even the all-devouring bunny rabbit. Here it was killing the same wretched selection of beasts again and again. A truly pitiful offering. Was this really the best this world had to offer? Incidentally, the next creature it found was literally known as wretches by the human inhabitants of the Backrooms. They were fleshy, zombie-like creatures that SCP-682 figured the Sarkists back home might enjoy. It couldn't believe that it was thinking fondly of that old place, while it carved the monsters to ribbons with its claws. It missed its old enemies like Dr. Bright, Dr. Clef, and even that irritating yellow blob of snot. The more it tried to take its mind off the old world by killing its way through this ant farm of endless tunnels, the more it found itself waxing nostalgic. For example, there were the plague goblins, impish little creatures with masks like that of a plague doctor. 682 found itself thinking almost fondly about SCP-049, while it listlessly ate the tiny, mischievous creatures, like a depressed person binging an extra-large pack of chips. Even their tiny squeaks as they crunched between the reptile's terrible teeth gave it no joy. What a bleak turn of events this had all turned out to be. As it wandered through the infinite tunnels, killing creatures and even humans as it found them, SCP-682 made a quiet promise to itself. Somehow, some way, it would make its way back to the universe it so recently departed. It would leave the Backrooms, no matter how many levels, a quiet, burning husk, and return to the world of fools and fiends it had taken for granted all this time. A visit to the Backrooms had taught the hard-to-destroy reptile an all-too-human lesson. Sometimes you don't know what you have until it's gone. Sure, the SCP Foundation may have tried to kill it in a new, bizarre, and increasingly sadistic way every single day, but that variety was the spice of life. It would return home someday, it knew that much. But of course, a lot of creatures and people would need to die before then. But if that's what it took, well, so be it. SCP-682 licked its dagger-like fangs and kept crawling.
Foundation researcher Marcus Hernandez was a professional in all aspects of his job. He was intelligent, being scouted for a job at the Foundation right out of college. He was brave, unyielding in the faces of the horrifying creatures and dangerous situations that working with the anomalous practically guaranteed. But most importantly, researcher Hernandez was cautious. He not only knew that keeping his hands at a fair distance from any newly discovered anomalous objects was a safe way to keep his head, he was also aware that it was sometimes better to take risks that would further his knowledge about an anomaly and how best to contain it. Sometimes those risks came with a price, like being part of the first team to study a recently discovered anomaly. To researcher Hernandez, it was better to lose the lives of the ones working to protect humanity from what lies in the dark than have any unsuspecting civilians stumble upon something potentially life-threatening. That's why he and his team took the assignment of studying SCP-1437 before anyone else in the Foundation was able to. They simply were not sure of what it was capable of, and researcher Hernandez's known attention to detail and cautious nature could best help the Foundation not only establish proper containment procedures, but also ensure that their own personnel were safe while doing so. As researcher Hernandez sat in the back of a jeep that rolled and tumbled over the arid landscape of the Mojave Desert, he reviewed what the Foundation knew about the anomaly. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. For starters, it was a 3-meter by 3-meter hole in the ground, originally thought to be an ordinary cave. As a result of its deceiving appearance, the anomaly went unnoticed for decades, until the Foundation picked up on a local story that was the talk of the town for a small group of camping and hiking hobbyists in Nevada. A camper, while out exploring and trekking through the dry dunes of the Mojave, was struck in the back of the neck with a U.S. quarter. While the object by itself is harmless, it came flying at the camper's body at an incredibly high speed, shooting from a large hole in the ground and striking hard enough to break the skin and wedge itself inside the camper's neck. After reaching the local hospital and getting the coin removed, it still left a small scar across the back of the camper's head. This unusual event prompted Foundation reconnaissance, which turned out to be entirely warranted, as observation of the surrounding area found several more objects buried around the area that were believed to have emerged from the hole, now designated as SCP-1437. A small canoe decorated with luminescent patterns, a calculator that added and subtracted letters instead of numbers, and a rotten apple core were all objects strewn around the immediate area. And if that's not strange enough, attempts to map out the hole failed, as all measuring equipment was lost after reaching a certain depth. Before the initial observation team picked up and left, SCP-1437 shot out large quantities of rock and dirt for over an hour, confirming that objects emerged from the hole at high speeds. Chemical analysis of the objects found around the area showed that they were composed of materials either unknown or not commonly found on Earth to warrant use in mass production. The observation team came up with a hypothesis. SCP-1437 was a hole that led to a parallel universe, and the objects it shot out originated in said location. Researcher Hernandez knew that this was just a hypothesis, but he had reviewed the lab results himself. Those objects certainly did not come from anywhere on Earth, and if the hole functioned as a gateway between worlds, that could explain why the measuring equipment was lost after a certain point. The Jeep came to a stop, and when researcher Hernandez stepped out, he came face to face with SCP-1437, a large hole sitting in the Mojave Desert. His crew was already hard at work, surveying and excavating the surrounding area for any other objects the hole had shot out that had been lost to time. A mobile analysis lab tent was set up in the distance, as well as several trailers for personnel living on site. Researcher Hernandez's personal decision to not use D-Class personnel in his research meant that each risk the SCP-1437 team took had to be calculated differently. They wouldn't send a person into the hole and risk loss of life when a drone could serve the same function without the potential drawbacks. But still, the initial observation team lost all of their equipment while trying to measure SCP-1437's depth. Why waste an expensive drone when the result would most likely turn out the same? It was these decisions that earned Hernandez's fame and respect at the Foundation, and over the next few weeks, his team was able to develop a wide knowledge base regarding SCP-1437 and establish safe containment procedures to keep the anomaly hidden from the public and easy to work with for Foundation personnel. First, a 2-meter-tall electric fencing unit was built around the perimeter of SCP-1437. This fence would not only keep unwanted trespassers out, but also had defensive capabilities due to the harmful electrical charge it could emit upon contact with an object. Groups of 3 security guard personnel were assigned to patrol this fence at all times, and they were instructed to deal with any trespassers through standard Foundation protocol. They would be taken into custody, interrogated, and as long as they were unaware of SCP-1437's anomalous properties, given a healthy dose of amnestics and released back into the general public. Anything that emerged from SCP-1437, be it a physical object or a living organism, would be cataloged by the Foundation and tested immediately for any potential hazards before further analysis could begin. If found to be safe, the items would be studied as much as possible. If not, they were stowed away in an area intended to keep them contained until a safe way to examine them was found. But perhaps the most important containment procedure researcher Hernandez established was the forbiddance of testing with SCP-1437. Due to the anomaly's mysterious nature and incredibly likely potential connection to parallel universes, testing could have grave and unforeseen consequences. When dealing with alternate or parallel timelines or realities, the Foundation is incredibly cautious and only interacts in ways that they're absolutely sure will not have any unexpected damage on baseline reality. That, and researcher Hernandez wasn't exactly keen on attracting the attention of these parallel universes without a solid understanding of who and what they were. As he would come to find, this inclination proved to be beneficial. As the team observed SCP-1437, they documented a number of notable objects that emerged from the hole, each supposedly originating from a parallel world. The first of which, however, was not anything the team hadn't seen before. The initial observation team sent to test whether SCP-1437 was actually anomalous had observed the hole emitting a mass of rock and dirt. For over an hour, SCP-1437 spewed earth and materials without stopping, filling the surrounding areas with debris. Since this was before the research team theorized the hole was connected to parallel realities, they weren't sure what to make of it. Was it a natural eruption? A poorly documented earthquake that somehow sent chunks of rock and dirt to the surface and shooting out of the hole? Though somewhat stumped, researcher Hernandez's team eventually came to a single solid conclusion. If SCP-1437 led to a parallel world or worlds, whoever was on the other side of the hole may have been attempting to fill it using natural materials. If they were attempting to fill it, could they be trying to contain it? Did the parallel world on the other side of SCP-1437 have its own foundation? This sudden thought gave researcher Hernandez pause and made him reconsider his hands-off approach to SCP-1437. Should his team attempt to contact whoever was on the other side? If it was a parallel branch of the Foundation, this behavior would be encouraged. The Foundation communicated with alternate versions of itself in time and space all of the time. The Department of Temporal Anomalies was built around this premise. But these were exceptions, not the rules. And communication with alternate foundations was always carried out with utmost safety and precaution. It was only done when there was a certainty that risk would be avoided. Researcher Hernandez was sure he made the correct decision, and he would stray away from attempting to contact those on the other side of the anomaly, even if they were another world's incarnation of the SCP Foundation. Weeks later, researcher Hernandez was awoken in the middle of the night by an excited assistant who, after calming herself down, informed him that SCP-1437 had spat out a new object. You have to forgive her if you were out in the desert for weeks staring at a hole waiting for it to do something and it eventually did it, you'd be pretty excited too. When researcher Hernandez ran outside to see what the team was freaking out about, he could have jumped for joy too. SCP-1437 wasn't spitting out rocks and dirt anymore. This time, it was a map, clearly illustrated to depict the continent of North America. But upon closer inspection, the team noticed some very apparent differences from a traditional map in the geography of our world. The map was written entirely in Spanish, and the names of countries and states it listed didn't match their existing counterparts. In fact, the entire borderlines of the map were mismatched, out of place, and radically different from anything resembling North America. It listed the government of the entire continent of North America as La República Popular de Aguas Nuevas, or when translated to English, the People's Republic of New Waters. This exciting find was logged and archived, and it was only the first of a series of objects that emerged from SCP-1437. A few days later, another object was documented. This time, it was a photograph. After initial scans determined the object to be safe to view, not harboring any dangerous mimetic triggers upon viewing or anything of that nature, the team analyzed the picture to the best of their abilities. They saw a breathtaking vista of a city skyline, unlike anything possible on this world. Intertwined with buildings were massive structures that appeared to be made out of coral. They wrapped around skyscrapers, branching from the ground and sometimes emerging from the buildings themselves. The coral broke through the tops of the tallest buildings, putting the man-made titans to shame. In the far background, a massive flying creature can be seen, peacefully floating through the air. This otherworldly visual overwhelmed the team, but after the initial shock wore down, a keen-eyed junior researcher pointed out that many of the buildings resembled known landmarks, though they were radically altered in noticeable ways. This wasn't just any city. It was New York City, only this time with coral and giant floating creatures. Exactly what the Big Apple's been missing this entire time. But this was still comprehensible and understandable for the Foundation. SCP-1437's true weirdness was still yet to come. A few days after the photograph emerged, SCP-1437 shot out a truly peculiar find. Researcher Hernandez and his team were stumped as to what its purpose was and what it signified, but they determined the objects to be completely safe and archived them regardless. The items in question were a series of discs made from solid gold, varying in size but never being obscenely large. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper that read, "Please send more rain." The Foundation was understandably puzzled. One working theory researcher Hernandez put together was that whoever was on the opposite side of SCP-1437 was paying tribute to the Whole as a form of worship and was asking the almighty beings on the other side to send more rain, for whatever reason. While the Foundation didn't exactly send the rain over themselves, whoever sent that request was probably pleased when a thunderstorm the next week sent torrents of rainwater into SCP-1437. We hope they're happy. The most notable discoveries that emerged from SCP-1437 occurred over a multi-year period. Previously, the research team theorized that SCP-1437 was connected to a single reality, and that whoever was on the other side of it was sending objects through, either by chance or by means of communication. This discovery proved that there wasn't just one parallel world connecting to SCP-1437, but many, an unknown amount, in fact. The items in question this time weren't just objects, but human cadavers. One by one over the years interspaced between the various oddities that SCP-1437 also spat out were human corpses, dead on arrival. The bodies were clad in Foundation-issue D-Class uniforms, though with some slight variations. This proved that the worlds connected to SCP-1437 were, in fact, alternate versions of the Foundation, or at least some of the worlds, as there was no way to tell who, what, or where the objects that emerged from SCP-1437 came from. Researcher Hernandez and his team examined the bodies with care and determined that they were dead long before they hit the ground, and that the gateway between worlds triggered the cause of death as they traveled between realities. Inside the D-Class jumpsuits, the team discovered pieces of paper, manuscripts that detailed their world's Foundation's documentation on SCP-1437. This deliberate inclusion of documentation signaled to the research team that there was an attempt at communication and cooperation from one world's Foundation to theirs. But why? The first body was clearly in adequate physical condition. It was protected due to being clothed in a pressure suit with an attached oxygen supply. The documentation read similarly to the SCP Foundation's documentation, though instead of special containment procedures and an object class, SCP-1437 was given a safety rating and safety containment procedures. These detail the Foundation that was giving civilians tours of their anomalies, where they could take photographs and even get close enough to view the anomaly from a close distance. The rest of the file was similar to what Hernandez's team recorded, and listed the following objects as those that emerged from SCP-1437. One small pyramid composed of concrete, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a landscape painting, believed to be a location in Scotland. According to the painting, its originating universe's sun is blue and its sky yellow. Several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the discs was a sheet of paper reading, "Please stop plague," a photograph of several scientists. All scientists pictured have unusually long fingers, estimated to be nearly 25 centimeters long. A sheet of paper reading, "Thank you, please send more gifts." The file continued with a notice explaining that the bodies of orange jumpsuited individuals holding documentation of the anomaly emerged from the Whole. The file's unfamiliarity with jumpsuits indicate that this world lacks a concept of D-Class personnel. The file mentions that, on the 15th of August 2012, a volunteer from the Foundation, Marco Perton, entered SCP-1437 wearing safety gear, taking with him a copy of this document. The second D-Class body examined by Hernandez's team was branded with the phrase, "Property of the SCP Corporation." The file described an item with a threat level of little, and a Foundation that was more focused on profit than containment. After objects emerged from the Whole, they were authorized to be sold to any interested collectors. Objects described by this version of the Foundation include a statue of what is believed to be a reptilian entity sporting numerous eyes and tails, large quantities of dirt and rocks, a glass bottle of water, a human femur covered in saliva, a cube comprised of several smaller cubes, all of which are different colors, purpose unknown, a soccer ball, ball only has 5 sides. The file included the SCP Corporation describing D-Class showing up, as they did in other worlds, and then the Corporation happily sending several D-Classes of their own through the Whole in an attempt to communicate with whoever was on the other side. The third D-Class body examined was heavily bandaged and appeared to be blinded. There were lacerations on its arms and legs, and its tongue had been removed. The file described a foundation akin to a religious cult. SCP-1437 was given a heathen level of unforgivable, and its holding measures described a high priest having to bless the hole every 2 years, and the need to perform blood sacrifices into it to ward off any demons. The wild incarnation of the Foundation interpreted SCP-1437 as a portal to the underworld, and described a list of objects emerging from it. It read as follows: several discs made from solid gold. Accompanying the disc was a sheet of paper reading, "Please kill foes." Large quantities of dirt and rocks, believed to be an attempt by demons to harm the High Priest, who was present at the holding site at the time. The broken remains of a human arm, covered in saliva. A photograph of a metal bird flying away from a city. What appears to be a large mushroom is visible behind the bird, believed to be an attempt by demons at mocking us. A human eye which moved when touched, believed to be a lesser demon, was burnt immediately. Unlike the other worlds, when this one received D classes through SCP-1437, the religious fanatics believed the bodies to be demons wearing the skin of men and threw the bodies back in the hole. The next D-class body observed by Hernandez's team was the most curious. It was a heavily emaciated child who had apparently been lobotomized. It described a foundation that sounds more like an organization out of a dystopian science fiction novel than anything else. The file spoke of a group of beings referred to as our masters above all, which the Foundation answered to. Any objects emerging from SCP-1437 were brought before the Masters. Any trespassers were interrogated by the Masters. This Foundation believed the objects SCP-1437 shot out were gifts for the Masters. Their list reads as follows: 1. Diamond. Large quantities of dirt and rocks. Bark from the extinct Quercus buckii, the lower half of a human body. Delivering to supervising servant of our masters above. It is currently unknown how the gift sender was aware of the diet of our masters above. A document was sent into SCP-1437 thanking the gift giver for the object and requesting further tributes to our masters above. A bottle of human-intended wine. While they certainly enjoyed the food of the human body, the wine was clearly misinterpreted. For whatever reason, this Foundation interpreted the wine as an assassination attempt on the Masters above all. As a result, they sent a large, anomalously powered explosive through SCP-1437 and into the world of an unsuspecting Foundation. The file continues with a notice from this Foundation's O5-1 which reads, "This is a reminder of why we must be vigilant in our containment procedures. From now on, I don't want any of these gifts being taken out of containment. They are a clear and present danger to our masters above." Looks like researcher Hernandez had the correct idea about not wanting to risk experimenting with SCP-1437. Attracting the attention of a reality where the almighty O5 Council answers to an even more powerful human-eating group of masters above all? No, thank you. This reality's Foundation is perfectly content alone.
True horror. The airplane door, belching smoke, and a burning red light. The dead talking in ancient guttural Latin. A monstrous angel made of rings, wings, and eyes whipping barbed tentacles at screaming, terrified priests. You can scarcely imagine a more hellish place. Bishop Franklin's knees gave out under him as soon as the man set foot back on solid ground. Nearing his 70th birthday, he'd never been a particularly tough man, but after the day he'd had, he doubted he'd ever be the same again. Almost being ripped into another dimension, almost being at the center of a nuclear explosion, seeing. He threw up on the ground as the Foundation personnel rushed over to him. Never, never again. Just 8 hours earlier, Bishop Franklin had been getting on with his Friday preparations. They had Mass coming up this weekend, so he was doing the rounds of the cathedral, putting out new candles and straightening pews. He was nearly done, ready to get on with the rest of his morning, when he saw 2 suited figures entering the cathedral. He shuffled over to them, trying to explain that they were closed, but quickly faltered when he saw the grave look on their faces. Just 10 minutes later, he was in the back of their car, still holding a spare candle, with agents from the SCP Foundation sitting on either side of him. They handed him file after file, each most redacted, explaining the basis of who they were and where they were headed. It was a lot for the old priest to wrap his head around. He'd always believed in a higher power and a spiritual realm, but this sounded a whole lot more serious than that. Monsters, aliens, other dimensions, facilities, portals. He questioned the agents on it. They just looked grimly from one to another as the car wound its way to the private airstrip in the middle of nowhere. Bishop Franklin had always hated flying, but he hated it a whole lot more as he approached the airplane with no idea where he'd be landing. A small group of men were gathered on the runway just by the foot of a Boeing aircraft. It seemed like a pretty substantial plane for such a small group of them. He was at least a little heartened to see that none of them had brought luggage either. In fact, most of them were just like him. As Bishop Franklin approached the group, he recognized various faces, other bishops, archbishops, and senior priests. With him there, they totaled 7. The others all looked at him, not saying much. Bishop Franklin tried his best to start asking questions, but 2 things happened in quick succession that closed his mouth very quickly. Firstly, the luggage hold of the plane was opened, and 2 enormous shapes were loaded into it via forklift. Each shape had unmistakable symbols on the sheets covering them. Nuclear danger. Reeling from this revelation, Bishop Franklin turned to the group to be face to face with the Pope himself. He immediately shut his mouth. You may also be wondering what on earth was going on at this airfield. The truth is, Bishop Franklin, along with 6 other priests of Abrahamic faiths, were about to embark on the monthly flight of SCP-616. Within this plane, as all of these men were soon about to find out, exists an emergency door. Covered with satanic iconography, this door, when opened at ground level, operates just like any other emergency door, leading to the outside of the plane. Although any individuals who had passed through this door in this normal state reported feeling heightened anxiety during and after. However, once a month, this door will be anything but normal, opening a gate to, well, you'll soon see. In order to mitigate the threat posed to humanity through SCP-616-1, or the Gate, the plane must be in the air at the time of its opening, far above and away from any human settlements. In order to keep this event contained, the door must be kept open for the duration of the portal's existence until it has closed of its own accord. But holding this door open is not a simple test of strength. It is a test of belief. In order to protect all of humanity from unknown horrors of a cataclysmic scale, 7 priests of Abrahamic faiths must be on board for this monthly flight, praying for the door to remain open. The ability to keep the door open, it turns out, is unrelated to physical prowess, but instead is based entirely on one's own belief that the door can be held open. As such, religious figures praying to a higher power are incredibly well suited to the task. Once per year, the flight is blessed by the Pope, and every time the plane takes off, it must be holding 2 nuclear warheads in its hull. Both can be remotely detonated by the ground team, who will be in constant radio communication with the pilot. Should the pilot fail to give them regular updates on the status of SCP-616-1, the event will be treated as an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, and both nuclear devices will be detonated without hesitation. But Bishop Franklin only knew about half of this information from his redacted set of documents, and had forgotten half of them on his stressful car journey. As he strapped himself into a window seat, he was trembling like a leaf. He desperately wanted to complain about being put into this situation, but he wasn't entirely sure who he would complain to. If he spoke to anyone external about what he was about to witness, he had been told by the Foundation agents that he would be administered with a Class C amnestic, whatever that meant. He really didn't want to find out. Fortunately for him, the most familiar of the faces from the group of priests sat next to him in the aisle seat. Bishop... what was his name? Sensing Bishop Franklin's uncertainty, the man reached a hand over and warmly reintroduced himself. Bishop Pete. They'd met 2 years ago in Berlin. Just that small action was almost enough to settle Bishop Franklin's nerves as the plane started to barrel down the runway. Almost. The plane took off, causing the old man's stomach to drop. Heart hammering, he looked around, spotting the emergency door. It was just up ahead of him, around the middle of the fuselage. It would have looked like a normal emergency exit, but for the blood-red markings scrawled across it. A wave of dread washed over him. It certainly looked evil, that was for sure. Trying his best to help, Bishop Pete struck up a conversation. He explained it wasn't his first time doing this. He'd been drafted to help 3 months ago. It was scary for sure, but everything was totally fine. The Foundation had planned everything to a T. It would have helped Bishop Franklin's nerves, but it only made his mind jump to the nuclear weapons he'd seen loaded into where his suitcase would have normally gone. The two of them lapsed into silence for a while. No one on the plane was really speaking. He supposed he should have used this opportunity to pray, but according to his briefing, he'd be doing a lot of that very soon. He hadn't entirely understood what the Foundation had meant by that. He'd been told to pray to, quote, keep the door open. What had they meant by that? A bang shattered the silence as the emergency door slammed wide open. In an instant, the plane went into a nosedive as all the air rushed from inside. The lights went out for several seconds, then came back on in flashing, panicked spasms. Bishop Franklin clung for dear life onto the back of the chair in front of him as the roar of air rushed around him. It had gone dark outside, with shapeless clouds swirling around him, shaking the plane. Screaming voices filled the aircraft, not just the voices of the men on board, but women and children too, crying out in agony and terror through throats that sounded like they'd been lashed with razor wire. Then he saw it. SCP-616-1. The gate was wide open. Smoke billowed out of it, crawling along the floors of the cabin like an octopus creeping its way along the ocean floor. Red light seemed to spill out of it, but when he tried to look through the gate itself, it was like his brain wasn't working anymore. There were colors there, but there were ones he didn't recognize. Maybe they weren't colors at all. It was like his brain fixated on trying to sort them into something that made sense, something rational. A hand grasped his arm and he turned to see Bishop Pete staring at him with wild eyes. The plane was going down, they could both feel it, and that emergency door was slowly creeping shut. They had been brought onto this plane for one job only, to pray, like their lives depended on it. Bishop Franklin screwed his eyes shut and clasped his hands together. He hadn't prayed like that since he was a little kid, but he figured now was the time to use all the tricks in the book. He begged and pleaded in a tiny voice for God to keep that door open. It felt so counterintuitive, so backwards, to want to keep that kind of door open as the air roared and screamed around him. But a small voice inside of him told him to persevere, have a little faith. But suddenly, the bishop noticed that the man sitting alongside him had fallen silent. Feeling like a naughty child at mass, he opened one eye and peered sideways. Bishop Pete was still in his seat, but he'd slumped over. He wasn't breathing. His skin was cold to the touch, deathly cold. Then all of a sudden, his head rocketed backwards and he started talking. Not talking like a normal man, but talking like a man possessed. His dead eyes rolled around in his head aimlessly as guttural voices rasped out of his throat. None of them were the words that Bishop Franklin recognized. They sounded almost like Latin, but far darker and more ancient. And the more the dead man spoke, the more the emergency door closed. The bishop started praying again, much harder this time, digging his fingernails into his palms so hard that he felt them drawing blood. He needed to keep this door open. He had to, and he could. He believed it entirely in that moment. The door banged back open, wider than ever despite the chanting of the dead body in the seat next to him. Nightmares swelled to the forefront of his mind as the plane hurtled to the ground. Only the plane wasn't hurtling to the ground. In fact, it was flying at a perfectly steady altitude of 10,972 meters, with an airspeed of about 780 kilometers an hour. In fact, aside from the death of Bishop Pete, everything within the plane was going perfectly to plan. Deaths of priests were just an occupational hazard of keeping this SCP contained. The pilot at the front of the plane regarded the whole situation playing out behind him while feeding constant information back to base. Everything was going perfectly according to plan, until the angel appeared. Bishop Franklin wasn't the first one to see it. That was the unfortunate lot of Archbishop Michael, who was sitting closest to the emergency door. He first spied it while staring through into the void, but his screams of terror, warning those around him, were drowned out by all the other commotion. It was only when the angel's wings crept their way through the edges of the door and the creature let itself into the cabin that the others saw it. But by this point, it was too late for Archbishop Michael. The angel was not like the angels we see in pop culture. A tall blonde person with white robes, fluffy wings, and a gentle face. It was a shifting mess of eyes and tortured wings, partially crawling along the ground, partially floating under the weight of its massive frame. It had to squeeze itself through the door to fit into the plane, but as it did, it lashed out at the Archbishop with a sinewy tendril and got to work, violently killing him. That was when Bishop Franklin saw it and began to panic. He wanted nothing more than to stop praying, to let the emergency door slam shut and keep this creature away from them. But that little voice inside his head told him that wouldn't work. If that door was allowed to close before the gate had, then it would cause the apocalypse. He could not have that blood on his hands. So he prayed, sweat pouring down his face as the angel forced its way through the gate and into the cabin. He prayed as it slumped across the aisles, working its way along the line of men, slaughtering them one by one. He prayed as it saw him and rose to its full height, unfurling great wings and readying itself for the kill. And he prayed as a wind more powerful than any on earth blew through the cabin and pulled the angel back through the gate. The emergency door slammed shut, and in an instant, the plane seemed to right itself. No more turbulence, no more wind. The light flickered once more and then came back on steadily. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling about 4 hours too late. Bishop Franklin couldn't believe the time when he looked at his wristwatch. He had been on this plane for weeks, surely, not just 4 hours. That was absurd. It all felt like a dream as the aircraft circled around the airstrip, preparing for landing. Everything in the plane seemed totally normal to him now, except of course for the 4 dead bodies, one of which was slumped towards him in the aisle seat. The plane landed. The bishop staggered down the stairs and threw up on the blacktop. After a few awkward moments, the pilot sidled over to him and muttered a quick thanks. "I was really close to calling it a failure there and having to set off them nukes. I don't know what you prayed for, but you did good today." Bishop Franklin didn't feel like he did good. He felt like he'd had his whole life, his whole worldview, turned upside down in the space of an interstate flight. He had been moments away from either being vaporized by a nuclear bomb or from having economy seats to the premiere of the destruction of the world as we knew it. But just 31 days later, Bishop Franklin was on that same flight again, praying his hardest as the aircraft dropped into freefall. If there was one thing that the Foundation noticed about working with religious leaders, it was that they had a real determination to keep coming back to help keep the world safe. What the Foundation didn't have the heart to tell them was that all of the satanic markings on the door were actually fake. They had been added by researchers in an attempt to make SCP-616-1 carry more significance for those in the aircraft. Later testing revealed that it was not exclusive to Abrahamic faiths, or any faith groups for that matter, that they could keep the gate open. Anyone who believed they could do it was capable of it. Faith leaders, however, are still being utilized, and the blessing is still being performed by the Pope on a yearly basis. It had been found that these external rituals, while not necessarily directly impactful, have strengthened the belief and resolve of those inside the plane, yielding fewer casualties and shorter durations. Various experiments have been conducted to see beyond the event horizon of the gate, to see what's on the other side. Those in the plane have reported as having the name Paradise, despite never going inside. A remote-controlled rover was sent inside the gate on one experiment, but the footage was deemed far too dangerous as all those who witnessed it died within 2 months. Hopefully, you didn't peer too closely into the gate as you watched this video.
What's in a name? Ancient folklore and fairy tales sometimes tell of the importance of names, that they can hold the power to summon or banish. Whether you buy into the superstition or not, you'd be unwise to ignore the power a name can have, especially if you ever dare to venture into SCP-4000. Why? Use your own name too many times in this extra-dimensional forest, and you may find that what walks out isn't you at all. At least once a year, the Foundation leads an expedition into SCP-4000 to explore this Keter-class dimension. But if you go down to those woods today, then you'd better follow the rules. Remember, the Foundation has implemented these guidelines for your own safety, and it's in your best interests to follow them. First and foremost, when referencing anything inside SCP-4000, be it a person, place, or thing, you cannot, under any circumstances, use names or titles. Communication is key when exploring SCP-4000, and making use of specific descriptors will deter any adverse effects on your journey. For example, you may want to refer to the location of SCP-4000 as the woods where you need to speak carefully, an apt description for such a place. Of course, there is a reason the Foundation doesn't provide a handy flashcard of alternative descriptors for any personnel taking part in the annual mission into SCP-4000. Nothing found there can be referred to with any consistent name, so it's perhaps advisable to look over a thesaurus and expand your vocabulary before visiting SCP-4000, as you'll need to come up with a lot of different ways to refer to the people and creatures around you. But don't worry, the Foundation will be able to train you how to properly refer to SCP-4000 in both written and verbal communication. In a similar vein, the second rule states that no personnel member should respond to their own name while in SCP-4000. Naturally, you and your fellow expedition team will not be alone in the forest you find yourselves in. The denizens of SCP-4000 are perpetually mutating creatures, some appearing to be trustworthy while others are hostile. It is for personnel members' own safety that no consistent names or titles are used to refer to each other in conversation. This has been known to cause personnel returning from SCP-4000 to experience vivid hallucinations, and in some instances has led to the appearances of creatures found in SCP-4000 in our world. Thirdly, when interacting with the life forms residing in SCP-4000, personnel are advised to accept any gifts that they're offered, but are warned to, under no circumstances, consume anything that is given to them while inside the forest. Finally, and above all, do not divulge any name, nickname, codename, alias, or any other personal designation when interacting with any native entities, and disregard any designator that an inhabitant of SCP-4000 attempts to assign to you. Personnel must, however, remain courteous in the presence of any native creature of SCP-4000 and treat these entities with respect and formality. Access to SCP-4000 can only be achieved by performing Procedure 4000 Halloway, a ritual requiring a steady flame in an indoor fireplace fueled by only organic kindling. Personnel are required to combine the powdered bones of one male lion, one male red fox, and a baleen whale, and cast these into the fire with a personal possession holding strong sentimental value to the staff member performing 4000 Halloway. Next, personnel are to add 3 feathers of a bird, such as a raven or crow, and must respond with the correct counterphrases once the fire begins to emit a voice. If these conditions are met and the correct response is given, Foundation personnel will gain access to the entry point of SCP-4000. If any error is made during the course of performing Procedure 4000 Halloway, then under no circumstances should this ritual be repeated. Staff are urged to apologize for any incorrect actions, then refrain from engaging in this procedure in the future. Should Procedure 4000 Halloway be completed successfully, Foundation personnel will find themselves arriving in the access point to SCP-4000, emerging from the mouth of an old well in the center of the forest. Exploration teams sent into SCP-4000 are advised that this dimension does not adhere to the laws of physical space that personnel will be accustomed to. There is a single, confirmed safe route that must be used when traversing the forest of SCP-4000, a dirt path leading in a circuit both beginning and terminating at the entry point. Previous attempts to map the landscape of SCP-4000 all confirm that the only way to safely exit this dimension is to follow the entire length of the path in one direction until eventually returning to the well. You have been warned. Any attempt to travel back to the direction you came in will result in a loss of contact with the rest of the expedition team. As mentioned, SCP-4000 is home to a number of entities, often noted to be undergoing continuous and dramatic changes in form. These physiological mutations appear to occur whenever these creatures are unobserved, making distinguishing between them difficult. When questioned about the exact nature of these changes, the inhabitants of SCP-4000 claim to have no control over them and express distress and dissatisfaction when said changes occur. Guidelines have been put in place by the Foundation regarding the interactions between personnel and creatures found in the forest, and adhering to the rules regarding the use of consistent names and titles remains vitally important. The native creatures appear semi-humanoid and are reported to be highly temperamental. Should any staff member happen to offend one of these natives, they may be subjected to anything from verbal assault to acts of extreme physical violence from the SCP-4000 resident. If any Foundation personnel further question why there are so many rules when visiting SCP-4000, then they need to look no further than the discoveries and fate of Dr. Eugene Japers, who during his initial initial expedition to SCP-4000 in 2005 encountered a humanoid native entity whose head resembled a rabbit's. As the pair shared a polite conversation, the rabbit-like creature made an inquiry regarding Dr. Japers' name, asking, "How is your name?" Keeping to the rules, Dr. Japers did not divulge any name or other form of title to the creature at this time. However, Japers remained courteous and polite during the interaction. The rabbit responded with the following: "Are you simple? I'm merely asking how your name is. My name has smelt of raspberries lately, I think, or snapdragons perhaps. It's so hard to tell these days, but one makes an effort." In his reply, Dr. Japers made a reference to his own name as having tasted rather tart as of late, before concluding the conversation with the rabbit entity. Upon returning to the SCP-4000 forest 3 years later, Dr. Japers was met with the same creature and once again engaged in conversation with it. After briefly discussing their previous encounter, Dr. Japers was able to turn their exchange towards something the rabbit had mentioned before, about finding it difficult to describe his own name. When asked to clarify this point, the rabbit replied, "I can only assume it's because of how long we've been apart, my name and I, that is. It's a good name, a proud name, I'm fairly sure. By this point though, it's probably decayed from its former grandeur, if it even still exists." After this mention of its relationship with its own name, it should be noted that the rabbit referred to Dr. Japers by the title Fellow Scholar. The third and final encounter between Dr. Japers and this entity came in 2013, after the doctor was sent into SCP-4000 with instructions to conduct a more thorough interview with the subject. It was during their third conversation that the Rabbit Man revealed details of a long-forgotten war between human beings and the residents of SCP-4000. Apparently, these creatures, the Fae, do not originate from the forest in which they now reside, and according to the Rabbit Man's claims, were born in our world. "Much as it grieves me to say, we were betrayed," the rabbit explained. "We had fought side by side, in the war against that factory. We had done nothing but help them, and what did they do? They destroyed us. They took so many of our lives and all of our names. Some of us fled here when the war was just beginning, but not many. Not many. Still, though, I don't hate them." It has been assumed by some that the Foundation was directly involved in whatever may have wiped out the Fae, causing them to either retreat or be banished to the forest of SCP-4000. An additional assumption has been made that whatever weapons were used on these creatures is directly responsible for their constantly shifting state, rendering them without their own names or identities. Whatever the case may be, it was during their conversation that Dr. Japers, in reference to their second encounter, referred to himself as a fellow scholar to the rabbit in order to coax information from him. However, in doing so, the doctor had unwittingly accepted the title that the native entity had given him. By mistakenly responding to the name Fellow Scholar, the doctor had broken the rules of interacting with the creatures of SCP-4000, an easy mistake, but a costly one. The doctor would later leave SCP-4000, traversing the safe path back to the well, and Dr. Japers vanished shortly after his exit from SCP-4000. His whereabouts are currently unknown. The Foundation has made several attempts to investigate his untimely disappearance, but to this day, he remains missing, and the fur left on the inside of his expedition gear displayed no strange properties. The single goal, it would seem, of the creatures residing in SCP-4000 is the theft of names. However, this naturally extends far beyond the Dimension's definition of identity theft. Though an unfortunate blunder, Dr. Japers allowed the friendly nature and demeanor of the rabbit entity to trick him into accepting the name Fellow Scholar. By giving Dr. Japers a name, the rabbit was free to steal not only his name, but his very identity. While it is unclear how this transference is achieved by the creatures, it is due to the risk of this that the Foundation employs such strict rules for any research team tasked with traveling to the forest of SCP-4000. Make no mistake, names have more power than we realize, and this is evident in few places more so than SCP-4000, a pocket dimension where ever-changing survivors of a forgotten massacre exist as identities alone. Remember, a name is a powerful thing, whichever side of the well you find yourself on. Your name binds you to who you are, but if your name becomes someone else's, then one else of yours becomes theirs too.
Are you afraid of haunted houses? What about haunted castles, or prisons, or mental asylums? We've all seen or heard tales of terrible tortured souls walking down long and lonely hallways, looking for people to pass their ancient pain onto. But what about something a lot more subtle? Perhaps as humble and unassuming as a cozy little woodshed. An adventurer named Kate would find that sometimes terrible things hide in simple places. With every step, twigs broke under the sole of her boot, their snaps echoing around the emptiness of the surrounding forest. Birds cawed down at her from their perches up above, a grave omen, a warning not to tread further. Well, at least to anyone who actually bought into all that superstitious stuff. Kat was far from a believer in that sort of thing, although at the same time, she had more than a passing interest in all things occult and unnatural. For her, it was less about the actual practice of certain things. The appeal was more about the stories that those practices inspired. Legends and myths, spooky tales of ghosts, or the dead rising from their graves, and of course, the magical mother of them all, witchcraft. Although her fascination with the inexplicable and macabre rarely, if ever, overlapped with her other big passion, hiking. Until, of course, today. She could trek anywhere and wanted to aim for everywhere, through sprawling national parks filled with vibrant greenery, up the sides of mountains, climbing up to the peaks, to across deserts, following the almost empty highways to get from one tiny rural town to the next. There was something about getting to not just know about the world, but to actively go and see it with her own two eyes, to actually be out there in it. That felt so right. On her current journey, Kate had taken herself on a long trail through the heart of the American Midwest, lugging a heavy pack over her shoulders, filled with her tent, sleeping bag, outdoor cooking supplies, and all manner of camping gear. She had set off following the winding path of the Patoka River, which ran around or adjacent to a few of the major cities in the state of Indiana. Kate was hoping to follow the flow of its main body of water all the way through to the city of Jasper. From there, it would be a straight shot over to the similarly named Patoka Lake, and after she had walked around the entire circumference of that, it would be a long hike east towards West Virginia, home of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sure, it was one hell of an ambitious trip for one person traveling alone, but Kate liked to keep her journeys unencumbered. Having someone else coming with her would just slow her down, or they wouldn't be able to keep up with her at all. There's no fun at all in that. Stopping for the night, Kate lit herself a campfire. She had to make sure to keep it far enough from the trees to avoid starting any potential catastrophes, but also not too close to the wet bank of the Patoka, otherwise her kindling wouldn't catch alight. There were so many variables to consider for any aspiring camper. Sparks from the flint that she always took on her travels struck the dry twigs she had collected, and soon a gentle orange glow and wave of low heat were radiating from it. The fire provided Kate with just enough light to unfold and peg down her tent as the diminishing visibility of the dusk gave way to the encroaching nighttime darkness. Before getting comfortable in her sleeping bag, she put out her campfire using water from the Patoka, then zipped up the front of her tent, keeping a flimsy cloth barrier between herself and the local wildlife. Not everyone found it easy to sleep in the woods as Kate did. She couldn't remember a time when the noise of breaking twigs or the sounds of movement outside had ever kept her awake. Even now, the rustle of leaves and branches did little to disturb her, regardless of whether it was just the wind or something else moving through the bushes. Woken up by the sun rising, its warm light breaking through the trees, Kate readied herself to leave. She never stopped at the same place for more than one night, and rarely slept for any longer than she needed to. A nice 8-hour recharge of her energy reserves, and then it was back to the open road. After a quick breakfast, she packed up her single-person campsite, folded up her tent, and stuffed it back into her bag. Kate had been just about to leave when she noticed something was missing. Her compass. It had been in her backpack, which she kept in the tent with her all night. Quickly scanning the ground around her, she couldn't see it. Weird. But she figured she had obviously dropped it at some point during her hike and would have to pick up a new one when she got to Jasper. It didn't matter. She could just follow the Patoka River as planned, although it didn't quite sit easy with her the rest of the day's trek. She'd packed the compass. That she was absolutely certain of. After all, she knew it wasn't like her to leave it behind. But then again, could she have forgotten it entirely? Over the next few hours, the question went round and round in Kate's head. As she walked along the bank of the river, silently starting to doubt herself, she drifted a little deeper into the woods, until out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something standing among the trees. It wasn't an animal, or even a figure, but a structure. Spending so much time out in nature, anything man-made usually stuck out as an obvious, unignorable eyesore to Kate. She looked at it from a distance. It looked like an old house, isolated out in the woods, a short walk from the Patoka River. Checking the sky over her shoulder, Kate noticed it was getting late again, the daylight having gradually lowered while she had been wondering about why she had left her compass behind, or if it had been taken. Deciding to set up camp closer to the little house, she turned and headed in to inspect it closer. The place was far from the lap of modern luxury. Not that Kate couldn't live without running water or electricity for long stints of time, but it wasn't a house that had been built recently. Although she was no expert in either archaeology or architecture, Kate didn't think anyone had lived there for decades, possibly even centuries. It was almost medieval, a single room that was completely ramshackle, practically falling apart at the seams. Everywhere she looked, the wood that had originally been used to build it was either rotting away or had been broken into splintered remains. Plants from the forest had started growing through the floors and the walls, as if nature was trying to reclaim this spot of land where someone had once come to get away from the rest of the world. Sighing, Kat shook her head as she looked at the dilapidated house. There was no way even she could sleep there. It was too much of a safety risk. Parts of the ceiling could easily fall on her during the night if the wind picked up enough. Turning to leave, she stopped in her tracks as she noticed another structure, much smaller, behind the house. It had been so dwarfed in size by the slightly bigger building that it was completely obscured from view, but it looked to be in much better shape in terms of its structural integrity. It was a woodshed, its front door hanging lazily open. While not exactly brand new by anyone's standards, it was at least far more intact than the main house. Taking a few steps forward, Kate felt something like glass crunch under the heel of her boot. She scanned the floor, instinctively checking for any more so as to not injure herself. Even with the low amount of sunlight fading ever rapidly, it didn't look like more. Kicking her boot to loosen the shard, she made her way towards the woodshed, not noticing that what she'd been standing on had been a compass. Reaching the shed, she peered inside. It was pitch black within, almost as dark as the rest of the forest would be in a few minutes. Taking off her backpack and setting it down, she searched inside for her flashlight. Retrieving it and flipping on the switch, she looked back into the shed, and that was when she saw it. Taking a step back, Kat tripped over her bag, scrambling back up to her feet to make sure she had seen what she thought she had. It was just lying there, still and lifeless. For a split second, she hoped it was a trick of the light, just an old decaying lump of wood, but it wasn't. It was a body. The remains were charred, reduced to little more than bones some time ago. Even the ground next to it looked like it had been scorched, blackened by some intense fire damage. Kate's eyes were so transfixed on the burned mass of bones that a sudden sound startled her. Thunder growled above, immediately telling her she had little choice in what to do next. Her options were either she could sleep outdoors and get drenched by the rain and possibly catch hypothermia from being cold and wet, or she could spend a night in the cramped confines of this woodshed, which she would have to share with a long-dead body. Walking back outside to retrieve her bag, she pulled out a ground sheet and used it to cover up the bones. It was a mostly sleepless night, and those were a rarity for Kate. Any sleep she did get was light, easily interrupted by as little as her own movements, and offered her no actual rest. But for the next few hours, she just lay awake on the wooden floor. It wasn't the sounds of rain drumming against the shed's ceiling, or the booming of thunderclaps that were keeping her awake. Thoughts of what she was going to do about the bones kept coming to the forefront of Kate's mind. Should she report it to the police when she got to Jasper? Was there even any point if she had no idea where on the map this abandoned place was? Frustrated, she tossed and turned, eventually sitting up as something made a sound. It was a low, creaking, rusty metal hinge, screeching for a lack of any oiling over the years. The door was open, swinging lazily in the decreasing winds, its lock having long since broken. Grumbling to herself, Kate reached for an old shovel that had been left in the shed and went to grab the open door. As her head poked out from the shed, she looked around. It was the middle of the night, nothing to be seen anywhere around. Yet, she couldn't escape the feeling she was being watched. Taking the shovel, she jammed it underneath the doorframe, keeping it closed. At last, there was quiet. Maybe now she'd be able to get some much-needed sleep. And she did, but that's when the nightmare started. The dream was bizarre, unlike anything Kate had ever experienced before. She instantly recognized the warm, flickering orange glow of a large fire before her. Naturally, she started to pace her way towards it, the fire's heat washing over her the closer she got. But as she approached, Kate noticed something moving amongst the flames. Arms flailed, trying desperately to extinguish the blaze, legs kicking and writhing, and that was on top of the screaming. Another figure was standing facing the bonfire, their back to Kate as she walked closer still. With every step, the sounds of insects buzzing could be heard getting louder and louder. But it wasn't until she stepped near enough that she saw where the noise was coming from. A swarm of bugs was darting through the air, hovering around the other figure. There were enough of the insects that they formed what looked like a cloak, every part of it moving and buzzing of its own accord. The whole nightmare was so vivid, Kate had no idea if it had been brought on by her exhaustion or that her mind was still fixated on the bones she'd found in the woodshed. Dehydration, lack of food, or even some other influence. It could have been any one of those factors that had caused her to dream a dream like this, or a combination of all of them. Nonetheless, she could feel the bugs tapping at her skin as she walked up to the other figure, still unable to see them clearly. The noise of insect wings whizzed past her ears louder than ever, loud enough to be real. Putting a hand on the figure's shoulder, Kate turned them around. It was a woman, or what was left of her. She had huge gaping wounds left by something that had been cruelly buried in her face. Yet somehow, she was still standing, dead but also alive at the same time. The swarm of bugs around her moved with her body as she turned and faced Kate, a pair of glassy eyes staring at her. They were both blank, completely empty, each one missing its pupil. Opening her mouth, the woman let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek. All around her, the sound of the bugs got louder, almost deafening, and as she screamed, so did Kate. Panting and shuddering, she bolted upright, shock racking her entire body, heart thudding against her ribcage. Instantly, the exact moment she woke up, Kate realized that feeling was back. She had spent so much of her time hiking through the woods on her own that she could tell when someone was watching her. In the dark, she fumbled for her flashlight and clicked it on to reveal the door was still jammed shut. Apart from her, there was no one else inside the shed, no one alive at least. Looking over her shoulder, she could see the bones behind her and immediately backed away from them, as far as she could in that tiny wooden hut. She had covered them before going to bed, she was certain of it, hadn't she? All of a sudden, Kate felt her skin start to itch, an intense, irritating feeling. She had experienced the effects of poison ivy and all sorts of plants that caused similar reactions, but this was easily 1,000 times worse. Her skin felt like it was burning. She scraped her fingernails down her exposed arm, trying to suppress the itching even for a moment, but it did nothing. She scratched at the other arm over and over again in one spot until her flesh was pink and raw. Still no change. Kate raked her nails over her own body, this time leaving a deep scratch trailing over her arm. Under the light of her torch, she'd realized that she'd drawn blood. She looked back at the bones in the scorched corner of the shed. The skull was facing straight towards her, hollowed-out eye sockets staring as empty as the pupilless eyes of the woman in her nightmare. It had done this. It must have done, she thought. Reaching towards the door, dropping her flashlight, she wrenched the shovel out from where she used it to wedge the entrance closed. She stood up, kicking her sleeping bag and backpack to the side. As hard as she could, desperate to make the itching stop, Kate brought the shovel downwards. The head of it snapped the already weakened floorboards of the shed, exposing the soft, dry earth beneath. Maybe if she buried those charred remains, whatever was happening to her would stop. Frantically, she started digging, hurling shovelfuls of dirt through the shed door. It listed further open, creaking loudly on its rusted hinges again, causing Kate to turn, startled at the sound of it knocking against the outer wall of the shed. Someone was looking right at her. She could feel it as real and as persistent as the itching feeling that crawled over her skin like the tiny legs of an army of insects. She dug further, eventually throwing the shovel to one side and dragging her hands through the exposed earth below, desperately burrowing through and only stopping to use any rock she found to try and stop the itch. All she achieved was drawing more blood. Her fingers touched something soft but solid, and Kate brushed away to clear more of the excess dirt, trying to uncover whatever it was. It felt like a long mass just beneath the ground, with a second similar object parallel to it. But the further along with it she reached, the quicker she realized what it was. A leg. Clearing more of the dirt higher up, Kate could feel more. A stomach, ribs, shoulders, and a head. Reaching for her flashlight buried under some of the dirt that had been dug up, she pointed it at the thing she'd found. The woman, the same one from her nightmare. Something inside her chest moved, scratching sharply, causing Kate to cough. And once she started, she couldn't stop. It was like the itching she'd felt on the outside had now worked its way inside, and it was spreading. No, moving. In fact, not just moving, but crawling. through her lungs, burrowing down into her stomach, and at the same time, upwards. The clawing of tiny legs digging their way up her windpipe, blocking it. Kate couldn't breathe. She dropped to her knees, retching as she struggled for air, sputtering as she felt something move at the back of her throat. That was when she heard the buzzing again. Locusts. A swarm of them came spilling out of Kate's mouth. She couldn't scream, let alone catch her breath. They filled the shed in seconds, engulfing her entire body, as more and more of the desert bugs still came pouring from her mouth. Outside, the wind kicked up again, with enough force to blow the door to the woodshed closed, trapping Kate inside with the bugs that tore at her. There was a single word on the wooden surface of the door, written in deep black charcoal. She'd missed it. The door had been open when she found the shed. The word was witch. The SCP Foundation would later find this cursed cabin and would naturally lose a number of D classes to a horrific form of locust-based suffocation. While there are clues as to what exactly is going on in this terrible place, from the malice of a long-dead sorceress to the lingering revenge of a woman wrongfully persecuted, definite answers as to the anomalous mechanisms of the shed known as SCP-4595 still elude even the Foundation's finest minds. It's a place so mysterious and dangerous that the special containment procedures read, "For safety purposes, no personnel are permitted to enter SCP-4595. SCP-4595 should only be entered by authorized testing personnel under the supervision of the SCP-4595 Research Lead. Under no circumstances is SCP-4595-A to be disturbed in any way." So perhaps we'll never truly know why a humble wooden shed in Jasper, Indiana causes such horrifying effects for its victims. The SCP Foundation thinks it's safer to just lock it away and forget about it, letting its ancient wood and old bones rot in the dark. But if you are really curious about the truth, you can always take a walk down the side of the Patoka River and pay the witch a visit. If you're lucky, you might even get to leave.
Salvation, Indiana was your typical Midwestern American town. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where everyone was comfortable leaving their doors unlocked at night, where there was a sense of trust between neighbors that you couldn't find in a more populated area. The kind of place where word traveled fast, and where people talked about things that were improper in hushed voices behind the backs of others. In Salvation, being an outsider or deviating from the norm was akin to complete isolation. You either fit in or you got out. And if you didn't, Salvation had its ways of making you conform to the mold. Gossip, organized stalking efforts, discrimination. These small-town methods were often employed by the town's inner circle to keep those who they had a distaste for in check. And unfortunately, this cliquish mentality can be the norm when it comes to small towns. There's nothing anomalous about the ugliness of human nature. But Salvation did have its secrets, the kind that, if brought to light, would tear a small town apart. The kind that attracted the attention of the US government's Unusual Incidents Unit, a branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation that dealt with the paranormal and supernatural. The US government's answer to the SCP Foundation. Between June 18th and June 23rd, 1976, the town of Salvation, Indiana underwent swaths of extreme anomalous activity that affected the town's entire population, but was mainly centered around Salvation's high school, appropriately named, well, Salvation High School. 2 UIU agents were dispatched to Salvation to assess the reports of anomalous activity, record it, and of course, help cover it up. This was one of the few times the UIU got the jump on an anomalous incident before a larger, more prominent organization such as the SCP Foundation or the Global Occult Coalition. Bet they got a company pizza party for that one. The operation went smoothly, with the agents using an early amnestic labeled Chemical 110 to wipe the memories of the townsfolk after interviewing them. Although in later years, study of Chemical 110 would prove it to be incredibly dangerous, as the amnestic was both toxic and had a degrading, damaging effect on human memory centers. Between this and the Foundation's early amnestic models also proving to be incredibly dangerous, the 1970s were an interesting time indeed in the field of supernatural cover-up operations. The timeline of events the agents established depicted an eerie scene. It was only a few days, but what occurred was both horrifying and strange. On Sunday night, 10th grade students at Salvation High School reported hearing what they described as someone trying to speak under the ground while passing by the school on their way home from a church service. One student reported it to her mother, who ignored it entirely. On Monday, an 11th grade student of Salvation High School claimed during gym class that he could hear voices coming from underneath the school's pool. Several other students corroborated this story. When school officials came to investigate, they didn't find anything unusual, but the UIU agents found that the lining of the bottom of the pool was cracked. On the same day, several female students reported seeing faceless things instead of their own reflections in a bathroom mirror. They did not seem bothered by this. During lunch announcements, many students described being able to hear a third voice alongside the two other students speaking unintelligibly below the broadcast. Curiously, the agents found that the PA room, where the broadcast originated from, sat in a media center near the pool. On Tuesday, students arriving at school noticed that the Indiana state flag was more than 3 meters above the top of the flagpole, attached to nothing, just floating. The American flag was not found, and more importantly, the students claimed they could see 9 female figures hanging by ropes from the flagpole, who disappeared immediately after being seen. During a biology class, one student suddenly stood up and rolled their eyes to the back of their head. They descended suddenly into the floor and disappeared entirely. Shortly after, they reappeared above a ceiling panel in the center of the room. No other students were able to identify the student, and several of their classmates insisted that their actions were just a joke. The UIU agents were unable to find proof of the student's existence in Salvation's enrollment records. Similarly, students described yet another student they didn't recognize walking the halls of the high school. They were unable to define any details of their appearance, save for one thing that stood out. They wore a purple satchel with the word syncope embroidered on the side. A custodian reported seeing something staring at him, standing at the bottom of the school pool. On Wednesday, the horror only sped up, as school staff noted that there was a full 2 inches of water across all levels of the school. For whatever reason, the school's principal decided not to close the school. At 7:56 a.m., the entirety of the student body heard an unknown voice whisper the word "hello" in their right ear. Members of the school band realized their instruments no longer produced any sound, but whenever they played, they reported seeing a small black human-shaped entity flickering in and out of view in the corner of the room, facing the wall. One student saw a dark figure walking up and away from the school through the air at an impossible angle. Eventually, the figure disappeared from her sight and was never seen again. No other student addressed this. On Thursday, a student in gym class avoided a dodgeball as it phased through his body. He sunk into the floor screaming for help. Nobody who noticed seemed motivated enough to help him. The entire school shifted roughly 1 foot off of its foundations at 11 a.m. The vice principal, who was sent to inspect the building's integrity, described seeing something small with too many faces grinning at him from underneath the building before the school inexplicably resettled back to its original position. The boys' locker rooms disappeared and were replaced with what witnesses described as something that screamed. They were unable to provide any details. As students left for the day, they saw 9 young women hanging in the air, tilted forward at an angle above the school's parking lot. They could be silently mouthing words, and their appearances were described by witnesses as ugly and unremarkable. They vanished, and again the majority of the town residents reported hearing a child's voice say the word "hello" below them upon the figure's disappearance. A panic ensued, as town officials had no explanation for these events. Salvation's principal made the call to close the school on Friday. However, when Friday morning arrived, the entire student body showed up for school. The building was locked, so the students simply waited outside to be let in. No individuals could describe why they were there. There was a knock on a window, and the students saw a small black entity standing outside of a second-story classroom. An entity phased in and out of the school's windows over and over until suddenly disappearing. After this, the front door unlocked itself, and the mass gathering of students entered the building. However, what they found was unlike the small school they had come to know over the years. Inside, Salvation High School was transformed into a non-Euclidean space, meaning that reality didn't work inside it the way it should. Hallways that led right instead led downward. Stairs that went up instead curved left. As the students moved through the school, they couldn't help but feel like they were always moving down, lower and lower. Some heard whispers, others heard drums in the distance. As they approached the basement, they saw a massive stone archway. Suddenly, the students shifted, encasing the entire group in rock and earth for 20 seconds. After this brief, suffocating torture ended, the students reappeared back in the school, except this time, every one of them reported being the only one in the building. They described the experience wandering the building alone before coming to what they called a doorway below a doorway, and ended up inside a small sub-basement room. There they saw 3 mysterious visions. A woman crouched over a body of water, surrounded and covered in blood. A farmhouse and a group of trees that were burning. 9 white humanoid figures floating in the air overhead. A weeping woman digging in a field until her hands began to rot and fall apart. When these visions subsided, the black entity reappeared again. It whispered hello, and the group of students were suddenly surrounded by 9 screaming female figures. After this, the students reappeared inside their own homes. It was at this point that the UIU began to enter the town to distribute amnestics to the subjects. More anomalous activity was recorded in rapid succession. Bodies hanging in the sky, water taps leaking human hair and mucus instead of water. Individuals reported that their facial features had disappeared entirely. Others reported seeing faceless creatures in the town. The black entity frantically appearing and reappearing in rapid succession throughout the town. Even a weeping young woman running back into the school's building, who witnesses lost after she entered the school's basement. The cover-up effort was brutal, but it worked. The townspeople of Salvation were convinced that they saw hallucinations as a result of toxic gases blown south from a factory up north. But what was the connection between all the phenomena? 9 faceless female entities, water, and blood. Something that literally upsets the entire foundation of Salvation High School. A small black entity. Adults in the town ignoring the things their children saw and acting indifferent toward them. All this sounds a lot like a dirty, dark secret being unearthed in the town of Salvation. Something people would rather turn a blind eye to and ignore. But they couldn't, because the terror was only getting started. A week after these events occurred, contractors assessing the damage to the school discovered the sub-basement room, where the students had various visions of anomalous entities. Behind it was the entrance that led to the large stone archway. This antechamber was discovered after one of the members of the contracting team slipped and fell beneath a collapsed section of wall and floor that led to the massive area underneath the school. The contracting team attempted to extract them, but they did not succeed. Their disappearance caught the attention of the SCP Foundation, who assessed the school and deemed the area beneath the school to be anomalous, as the building's architecture should not be able to accommodate the size of the area. It was designated SCP-3935, and as the Foundation began investigating it, they were determined to uncover the truth of what really was occurring in Salvation, Indiana. While exploring SCP-3935, they came across the stone archway, a piece of architecture whose origins are unknown. Inscribed on the arch was a phrase that read,
The way below winds deeper, longer, unspeakable its patterns laid, the lost forever damned to wander, this thing a quiet madness made.
After the initial establishment of SCP-3935 as an anomalous location, the Foundation poured deeper into Salvation's mystery and came across the documents created by the UIU agents. The Foundation, being much more thorough in their containment methods than the UIU, decided that the small town of 1,400 people was easy enough to relocate entirely, and the entire area could be condemned, feeding into the excuse of a hazardous waste facility nearby, leaking noxious gases into the town's water and air supply. With the townsfolk successfully relocated, Salvation was quarantined and cut off from the rest of the world. Roads were removed and rerouted, and Foundation personnel turned over any trespassers to local authorities. Salvation High School became a hub for Foundation researchers studying SCP-3935 and the events that occurred in the town, and the building was heavily guarded when not in use by the organization. The initial exploration attempt into SCP-3935 was conducted by a team of Foundation agents, shortly after members of the contracting team were lost. There was a slight hope they could be recovered, and the effort was dubbed a search and rescue mission. 3 agents, Ellis, Porter, and Haskell, were tasked with entering SCP-3935, all equipped with recording equipment and a shoulder-mounted lamp system. They entered a cramped, narrow space beyond the archway, where the subterranean stone walls got tighter and tighter, and the air felt stuffy and uneasy. On the walls, images resembling a child's drawings were carved into the rock. As the teams continued to push through the rock tunnel, they found it difficult to breathe. The walls were getting narrower, too close for comfort. Suddenly, Porter's voice cut out, and his camera feed went black. When it came back, it appeared to be looking up at 2 sources of light, most likely the other 2 agents' lamps, as Porter fell from a great distance. His screaming was heard on both the cameras and by the other agents, but they couldn't figure out where he was. Ellis and Haskell began to panic, moving faster and attempting to struggle forward. The rock tunnel was so tight, so constraining, that they were unable to move more than a few steps in a second. After a short period of time, both men fell forward into a larger open space. As they searched for Porter, who wasn't behind them, they came to the conclusion that he must have fallen into a ravine or slipped beneath the rocks. There was no other explanation for how he disappeared so suddenly, but their talk was cut short when they realized what was in front of them. They hadn't noticed it at first, but when they turned their lamps forward, they noticed a gigantic structure, seemingly carved out of stone. It resembled Salvation High School almost perfectly. The main entrance was visible, and the windows too, a stone replica of the school, hidden in this massive underground area. The agents couldn't believe it. There was a thick layer of fog in front of them, but they could make out a narrow stone bridge that extended across a large chasm, leading to the stone replica of the school. As they examined further, they noticed that underneath the school was another model of the school, and under that one was another. It went on indefinitely, extending deeper and deeper into the ground, in the direction that all things in Salvation seemed to go, down. On the other side of the bridge, hanging mid-air, were 9 female entities, their faces obscured by long white hair. The 2 agents stood still in fear. After a short time, the figures appeared 10 meters backwards, and then another 10, and then they appeared right in front of the door of the stone school structure. Slowly, they lifted their heads, revealing their featureless faces to the agents, who recoiled in fear. After that, they disappeared. The 2 agents debated going back for reinforcements, but they pushed onward after hearing the sudden sound of many voices speaking in hushed tones in the distance. It could have been the lost contractors, or their lost man, Porter. They entered the stone school and began searching. Inside, they couldn't make heads or tails of the architecture. As they ran down the hallways, following the sound of the voices, they noticed that the halls seemed to stretch on forever, but they didn't seem to notice the watching, featureless faces who observed the agents from the window panes in the doorways. As the agents came to the auditorium doorway, Agent Haskell let out a scream, and his voice recorder disconnected. At this point, what occurred became nearly impossible to make out on the Foundation's recording. The voices grew louder. Haskell's camera shifted perspective to the floor. 9 female entities appeared around Agent Ellis, contorting their bodies into impossible positions. Haskell ran, but the entities pursued him. He screamed for help. Eventually, the figures hung in the air, unmoving. Haskell slowed down too and slowly turned around, coming face to face with a small black humanoid entity sitting upside down on the ceiling of the hallway. It whispered one word: "Hello." The feed cut out to the choppy sounds of audio distortion. A snapping noise was heard, and then silence. And then all 3 agents' feeds returned. For the duration of the exploration recording, Haskell, Ellis, and Porter lost their minds in the depths of SCP-3935. In between periods of silence, they laughed, screamed, and shouted incoherently, rambling on about how dark it is and how they can't go down any further, below, where it goes on forever, where they can be part of the 9, be a part of Salvation, where they can fall forever. And after that, silence. The feed was cut out completely, and neither the trio nor the contractors were ever recovered. After this failed, horrifying exploration attempt, more anomalous activity occurred in the town during the Foundation's occupation. Sightings of the 9 faceless entities in the streets and the trees. an agent who saw the black figure constantly in his peripheral vision. Sounds coming from a grove of trees near the school, which led to a cabin and 9 corpses of former Salvation High School students in the backyard. But before they could investigate, the female entities appeared once more, and they were unable to locate the grove again. The Foundation's investigation of Salvation continued through the decades, interviewing former staff members of the school and residents. They were trying to piece together any semblance of a coherent story, to find a way to connect all these dissonant elements into something understandable. The black figure, the corpses, the buried secrets, and the 9 female entities. How did it all connect to the school? In 2002, a Foundation agent interviewed Mrs. Fletcher, an English teacher at Salvation High School during the period of anomalous activity in 1976. The interview started out ordinarily enough. Fletcher, in her old age, couldn't remember much. She remembered the town was quiet, with a tight-knit community. They didn't even need a police force because there was so little crime. She remembered students would go into the woods and chase ghosts, or claim they saw things, but it was never anything too strange. But as Fletcher continued to talk, she let her mind wander more and more. She recounted how there was a disappearance at the high school, a girl who was last seen by the school's pool. The town assumed she ran away. After all, there were some individuals who held strong opinions in Salvation, the kind of opinions that didn't sit right with some of the younger residents. The church was important in Salvation. Nearly everyone went. Fletcher opened up some more. There was a scandal, she recalled. A teenage girl on the school cheer team who ended up pregnant out of wedlock. She couldn't recall her name or what she looked like, but she remembered the town's inner circle was in an uproar about it. She didn't want them to know. She didn't want anyone to know. It was a secret she could barely keep from spreading. It must have been destroying her, Fletcher explained. She couldn't remember much about the girl, but she did remember that the girl would always say hello to her. Too many times, in fact. Eventually, the girl was found hanging in the woods, right outside of a log cabin. They found a note in her hand, which contained a drawing of a building that resembled the high school, and on its back, the repetition of the same word over and over again. But Fletcher couldn't recall what the word was. The Foundation agent was about to close the interview out, but he had one last thing to ask. He produced a picture of the unidentified 9 female figures that were haunting the town and showed it to Fletcher. She became noticeably pale and short of breath. "Do you know anything about this, Mrs. Fletcher?" the agent said. She collected herself and examined the image as best as she could, her hand shaking.
Why, yes I do. Those are, the cheerleaders. They were, well, let me think. There were 10 of them, though, I think. Unless something happened to one of them, there were definitely 10.
The Foundation didn't have to ask what happened to the 10th. Now go check out SCP-1337 The Hitchhiker and Revenge of D-Class Ghosts SCP-4973 Dead Men Walking for more ominous hauntings that keep the horrors of the past alive and well.